Hey there, Drowsy Historian here. Tonight, we're trudging through the entire history of Rome. You'll hear of wolves raising kings, of senators stabbing each other, of emperors who burned, sulked, or went mad, all while ordinary Romans queued for bread. This isn't the polished marble fantasy. It's the sticky, bloody reality of a city convinced it would never die, even as it was already rotting. Before we grind our way through centuries of conquest and collapse, do me one small favour. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. If you'd prefer these stories without ads, you can join the Patreon. It's linked in the description. And if you listen to these in bed, consider using a pair of wireless sleep earbuds for enhanced immersion. They're comfortable, discreet, and designed for side sleepers. I've linked my favourite pair in the description. Now, lie back. Get comfortable. Let's begin. Rome liked to call itself eternal, a city without end, the beating heart of civilization. Yet eternity, as it turned out, smelled an awful lot like sewage. If you stood in the forum on any given day, you'd hear orators shouting themselves hoarse over debts, grain shortages, or the latest military disaster. The marble columns would gleam. The statues of gods would tower in reassuring grandeur, but the ground beneath your sandals would be sticky with waste. The alleys beside you choked with smoke from cheap fires, and the air buzzing with flies that treated Rome's citizens as their own inexhaustible feast. 1,000 years of empire is impressive on paper, but in practice it was little more than an endless shuffle through civil wars, corrupt bargains, public executions, and a population that never seemed to learn from one century to the next. Rome was an experiment in how long human stubbornness could disguise itself as destiny. From its earliest days, Rome's story was not one of peace but of violence and theatre, each reinforcing the other. The republic that people still admire today was essentially a long-running feud between the rich and the slightly less rich, with ordinary citizens shuffled about like props in a tragic play. The empire that followed, with its soaring aqueducts and sprawling roads, is often praised for efficiency, but most of its efficiency lay in killing faster, taxing harder, and ensuring that every new generation of emperors could find more elaborate ways to demonstrate their paranoia. Even its triumphs were grotesque. The Colosseum filled with animals imported from 3 continents only to be butchered for applause, or the endless stream of generals returning from foreign wars, parading captives through the streets as though human beings were just another form of loot. To call Rome eternal was less a boast of stability and more a desperate insistence that this particular brand of chaos would never end. And yet, the myth has clung to it. Rome presents itself as the exception to human frailty, a city chosen by fate to rise above the ordinary decay of kingdoms. But when you scrape away the marble facade, what you find is not eternal order, but eternal repetition. Reforms proposed, ignored, and drowned in blood. Leaders adored, overthrown, and forgotten. Victories celebrated only to be eclipsed by the next humiliation. The pattern is so steady it becomes hypnotic, a drumbeat of expansion and collapse that never seems to reach resolution. For the people who lived through it, Rome wasn't eternal. It was exhausting, a 1,000-year headache that only ended when the West finally stumbled into silence. Still, to understand Rome, you must first understand that it never thought of itself as ordinary. From the beginning, it cast its story in myth rather than mud, pretending that gods had laid the foundations where men had merely fought over hills and cattle. The truth is that Rome's origins were as bloody, petty, and human as any other settlements, but Romans dressed them up with legends of divine wolves and heroic founders. That perhaps was the most Roman trait of all, to take a village of huts and murders and declare it eternal destiny. And so we begin, not with facts, but with a tale of twins, a riverbank, and a wolf that nursed the future masters of the world. According to the legend, the twins Romulus and Remus were the unwanted offspring of Mars, god of war, and Rhea Silvia, a Vestal virgin whose job was explicitly to remain chaste. Her failure to do so, willingly or otherwise, conveniently tied the Roman state to the divine right of war, as though even the god of slaughter had wanted to sire the founders of this city. Cast out as infants, the twins were set adrift on the Tiber. By all logic, they should have drowned in muddy water, another pair of anonymous corpses swallowed by the river. Instead, the story tells us, a she-wolf appeared, licked them clean, and raised them as her cubs. There is something grotesque about this beginning, and the Romans were aware of it. Wolves were predators, dangerous, and not exactly nurturing symbols. The animal chosen to embody Rome's maternal instinct was a creature known for tearing sheep apart and haunting the countryside. The fact that Romans embrace this detail without shame tells you everything about their appetite for contradiction. They like to think of themselves as both vulnerable orphans and violent predators, suckling at the teat of danger itself. By claiming a wolf as their wet nurse, they announced from the beginning that the city would be fed on blood and fear. It is, in its way, brutally honest. The myth then proceeds with the usual heroic embellishments. Rescued from wilderness, the twins grow up strong and restless, destined to found a city. But they quickly encounter the problem that would plague Rome for centuries. There were two of them, and only one throne. Roman myth, like Roman politics, could not tolerate equals. The story insists that the matter was to be settled fairly by augury, the sacred art of reading the will of the gods through the flight of birds. Remus saw 6 vultures, Romulus saw 12, and because numbers always win over timing, Romulus declared himself favoured by heaven. Remus mocked the process and jumped over his brother's half-built walls to show how weak they were. Romulus promptly killed him. Thus Rome was founded on fratricide, its very first act a murder carried out in defence of pride and boundary stones. If later centuries saw senators slaughter one another for offices or emperors strangle their own sons, they were only following the precedent set by their divine founder. What matters is not whether any of this happened, but that the Romans believed it should have. Myths, after all, are not histories. They are excuses written in the language of eternity. By tying their origin to the war god, to a wolf, and to a brother's murder, Romans explained to themselves why violence was not just common, but sacred. If Romulus could kill Remus to defend a line of ditchwork, then a consul could butcher his rival in the forum, and an emperor could wipe out a family to secure succession. The story gave permission, draped brutality in inevitability, and insisted that Rome's greatness required cruelty at its root. The symbolism did not end with blood. After founding the city, Romulus supposedly gathered men around him, but discovered they lacked wives. His solution was the infamous rape of the Sabine women, in which Romans invited their neighbours to a festival, then abducted the women while driving off their fathers and brothers. It is presented in Roman law as a kind of civic necessity, the desperate act of a young city in need of growth. The women once carried off were told to dry their tears, accept their fate, and be grateful for marriage to Rome's chosen. This grotesque episode was not told with shame, but with pride. Later, historians framed it as the moment Rome turned violation into legitimacy, conquest into family. In other words, abduction was rebranded as policy. If this is how Romans explained their earliest days, it is no wonder their empire would later justify enslaving entire peoples while calling it civilization. These myths were taught and retold for centuries carved into reliefs, painted on walls, and recited by poets who were expected to flatter the state. Children grew up hearing that their city had been nursed by a wolf, consecrated by murder, and multiplied by kidnapping. The lesson was unmistakable. Rome was not built on fairness or virtue, but on seizing what it needed and writing the gods into the justification afterward. When citizens cheered in the Colosseum as men were torn apart for entertainment, they could comfort themselves with the knowledge that even their city's founders had spilled blood in the name of destiny. Violence was not only normal, it was original, part of the birthright, and yet for all its brutality, the myth carried an undercurrent of insecurity. Why else tell such an improbable story? Cities that are confident in their origins simply state the facts. We settled, we built, we endured. Rome could not. It had to drape its mud-walled huts in the grandeur of Mars and wolves, because the truth, that it began as another squat on a riverbank, was too ordinary for the empire it imagined itself to be. Every exaggeration was an apology, every divine flourish an attempt to make mud into marble. In that sense, the myth of Romulus and Remus is less a history than a nervous boast, a city protesting too much that it was chosen, special, and fated. For the modern listener, it is easy to laugh at the absurdity. 2 children suckling at a wolf, one killing the other in a fit of pride, abducted women turned into wives. It reads like a parody of civilization. But for Romans, this was the explanation of who they were. If their empire seemed harsh, well, it was meant to be. If it seemed bloody, that was in the blueprint. Every time they looked at their bronze statues of Romulus raising a sword, or at reliefs of Sabine women clinging to their Roman husbands, they were reminded that Rome was forged in violence and sanctified by it. The empire did not drift into cruelty by accident. It claimed cruelty as its inheritance. The story also reveals Rome's tendency to believe its own propaganda. Myths that began as convenient justifications hardened into national identity. Generals marching across Gaul or emperors taxing the provinces could point back to Romulus and say they were acting in continuity with the founder. The wolf had given her milk, Mars his bloodline, the gods their auguries. Who were mortals to question policies of conquest or tyranny? In this way, myth and politics merged, creating a cycle where past violence excused present violence and present violence reinterpreted the past. That cycle would carry Rome forward for centuries, each new atrocity appearing less as an aberration than as a fulfillment of destiny. And so Rome begins, not with order, not with virtue, but with the embrace of contradiction. A city that worshipped wolves, yet called itself civilized, that praised rape, yet claimed to value family, that celebrated murder, yet called itself chosen by the gods. The myths are less foundation stories than cautionary tales, though Romans never read them that way. Instead, they became the bedrock of pride, as though a city born in violence could ever be anything else. The truth, of course, is that behind every myth was a political need. The tale of Romulus and Remus gave Rome divine sanction. The Sabine abduction gave it demographic growth. The wolf gave it ferocity. They were tools more than traditions, propaganda dressed in poetry. But by believing them so fervently, Rome locked itself into a cycle of justifying every future atrocity by pointing back to the divine mess at its beginning. To understand the empire's later excesses, one only needs to look at the stories it told about its first breath, and the Romans were not finished with these stories. Beyond the wolf, the twins, and the stolen brides, they imagined a line of kings, part myth, part memory, who each embodied some lesson about war, piety, ambition, or cruelty. Whether these rulers ever lived as described hardly mattered. What mattered was that Romans told their history through them. With the myths of birth laid down, the city now crowned its first monarch, Romulus, the brother killer who would be remembered as Rome's first king. From him, and from the 6 who supposedly followed, the pattern of violence and ambition would only deepen. The early Romans, who had not yet invented the elaborate political theatre of the Senate, seemed happy enough with one man at the top, provided he had the charisma to keep them in line and the appetite for violence to defend their fragile settlement. Romulus embodied both. His reign, according to the tradition later written down, was equal parts military recruitment drive and opportunistic kidnapping. He is said to have created the first Roman legions, organising the rough collection of shepherds and wanderers into something resembling an army. Yet his greatest act was not military, but matrimonial, or rather, anti-matrimonial. When Rome realised it had plenty of men but no wives, Romulus devised the infamous abduction of the Sabine women. Cloaked as a festival, the gathering turned into mass seizure, with Roman men dragging their guests' daughters from the celebrations. Later chroniclers, uncomfortable with the word rape, would soften it into marriage by capture. But the violence of the act was never in doubt. The Sabine men prepared for war, yet in the myth, the women themselves supposedly intervened, pleading with their fathers not to destroy their new husbands. It is a grotesque fairy tale, one that makes violation the cornerstone of civic unity. Rome, from the outset, declared that its growth would be achieved through force, and then retroactively sanctified by the language of family. Romulus ruled for decades, waging small wars against neighbouring tribes, and stitching together a population through a mix of coercion and myth. His reign ended, appropriately, in confusion. Some said he was carried bodily into heaven by Mars and transformed into a god. Others muttered that senators had grown tired of his arrogance and hacked him to pieces, concealing the fragments beneath their cloaks. Either way, the story made it clear. In Rome, a ruler could be divine one moment and dismembered the next. It set the precedent that power was glorious until it wasn't, and kingship itself balanced precariously between sacred aura and mortal vulnerability. After Romulus' vanishing, the throne passed to a Sabine named Numa Pompilius, a man whose reign demonstrates Rome's habit of alternating between blood and ritual, like a pendulum swinging between extremes. Numa was everything Romulus was not: pious, peaceful, and dedicated to religious order. He supposedly established Rome's priesthoods, the cult of Vesta with its eternal flame, and the elaborate calendar of festivals that would shape Roman life for centuries. Under his reign, Rome ceased fighting long enough to remember that it required law and ritual, as well as swords. He was credited with building temples and organising augury into a state office, ensuring that no future Roman decision could be made without consulting the flight of birds. Numa's rule painted a veneer of sanctity over the mud and blood of Rome's foundations, but beneath the rituals lay the same lesson. The city required structure to contain its violence, even if that structure was dressed in superstition. When Numa died, Rome immediately snapped back into warlike habits, proving that peace was only ever a pause between battles. Tullus Hostilius, the third king, swung the pendulum violently back toward aggression. If Numa had been the priest, Tullus was the general. He reignited conflicts with Alba Longa, another Latin settlement, and resolved them with one of Rome's most theatrical episodes: the combat of the Horatii and the Curiatii, two sets of triplet brothers fighting to decide the fate of their cities. It was ritualized war, efficient in body count, and perfectly Roman in its willingness to turn bloodshed into entertainment. Tullus's wars expanded Rome's power, but his piety was lacking. The story goes that he attempted to perform a religious sacrifice incorrectly, angered Jupiter, and was struck by lightning. Rome, it seemed, still believed that kings who neglected the gods would not simply fail, but explode. In this way, myth maintained its grip. Rulers were never just men, but conduits for divine approval or wrath. Their deaths staged as moral lessons for those who followed. Next came Ancus Marcius, who blended Numa's priestly devotion with Tullus's appetite for conquest. He extended Rome's territory to the sea, founded the port of Ostia, and fortified the Janiculum Hill. Ancus is remembered for incorporating conquered peoples into the Roman fold, a strategy that would define the empire centuries later. By offering defeated enemies a place within the Roman system, he gave Rome a steady supply of manpower for both labour and war. Yet this inclusivity was not benevolence, it was pragmatic exploitation. To be Roman meant to be useful, and Ancus ensured that the city's strength rested not only on bloodlines, but on its ability to absorb outsiders and convert them into instruments of expansion. The paradox of Rome, that it feared foreigners yet depended on them, was already visible in the policies of its fourth king. With Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, Rome entered a new stage. Known as Tarquin the Elder, he was said to have come from Etruria, a reminder that Rome's identity was never purely Latin, but stitched together from neighbouring cultures. His reign introduced grandeur. He is credited with beginning the construction of the Circus Maximus for chariot races and initiating major public works. Tarquin's rule brought spectacle into politics, teaching Romans that entertainment was as essential to power as swords. Yet it also highlighted the dangers of ambition. His eventual assassination at the hands of rivals demonstrated again that Rome's throne was never secure. Kingship might carry divine approval, but knives in the dark remained an occupational hazard. His successor, Servius Tullius, embodied both innovation and insecurity. Raised as a slave or of low origin, the details shift depending on which historian you consult. Servius supposedly rose to power through marriage and cunning. He reorganized the Roman population into classes based on wealth, establishing the census that would later define military obligations and voting rights. In doing so, he tied civic identity directly to property, embedding inequality into the very bones of Roman politics. Servius expanded the city's walls and strengthened its defences, but his low birth left him vulnerable. His reign ended when his own daughter, Tullia, and her ambitious husband, Tarquinius Superbus, arranged his murder. In one of Rome's grislier legends, Tullia supposedly drove her chariot over her father's corpse, spattering herself with blood as she claimed the throne for her husband. If Romulus had set the precedent of fratricide, Servius's end confirmed that parricide and betrayal would also be standard features of Roman leadership. The final king, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, lived up to his name. He seized power through violence and ruled with arrogance, dispensing with the Senate and governing as a tyrant. He relied on fear and spectacle, continuing great building projects such as the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. But his disregard for shared governance alienated even Rome's elites. His downfall came not from foreign wars but from a domestic scandal. His son, Sextus Tarquinius, raped a noblewoman named Lucretia, who then took her own life after demanding vengeance. Her death galvanized Rome's aristocrats, who rose against the Tarquins. The monarchy, they declared, was finished. It was not simply Tarquin's tyranny, but the violation committed by his household that proved intolerable. Rome's first revolution was born out of outrage, and the kings were expelled. Thus ended the reign of the 7 kings. In the stories preserved, one sees the cycle that would haunt Rome for centuries, rulers alternating between piety and war, innovation and cruelty, each downfall drenched in violence or betrayal. The monarchy was overthrown, but not because Romans disliked power. They simply disliked who held it. In its place, they would create a republic, a system designed to disperse authority among senators and consuls. Yet anyone who imagines this as a leap toward freedom is in for disappointment. The habits of ambition, treachery, and arrogance that defined the kings would resurface in the new system almost immediately. Tarquin's expulsion was less the end of tyranny than the start of tyranny by committee, proving once again that in Rome, corruption never disappeared. It only changed uniforms. When the Romans expelled Tarquin the Proud and declared an end to kingship in 509 BCE, they congratulated themselves on achieving freedom. In truth, what they created was not liberty, but bureaucracy, a labyrinth of offices and vetoes where the same few families clutched power with new titles. Instead of one king to hate, there were now 2 consuls, each serving for a single year, and each armed with the power to cancel the other's decisions. It was the political equivalent of trying to row a galley in 2 directions at once. The Romans liked to present this arrangement as balance and fairness. In practice, it was gridlock with extra steps. Still, for a society that distrusted monarchs, it was enough. They could boast that no one man ruled them, even as the same aristocrats passed authority back and forth like a family heirloom. At the heart of this new republic were the patricians, the old noble families who claimed descent from Rome's earliest days and who made certain no law was written without their approval. The common people, the plebeians, were promised a share in the new system, but what they received instead was the privilege of serving in the legions, dying in wars, and returning home to debt collectors. The Senate, that august body of landed elders, claimed to embody wisdom and tradition, though most of its wisdom seemed to involve protecting its own estates from taxation. Romans would later romanticize the Senate as a symbol of stability, but in the early days it was little more than a club of wealthy men determined to keep Rome safe from kings, and even safer from redistribution. Liberty, in other words, meant that the rich could now govern themselves without a Tarquin interfering. The Republic's early years were defined not by grandeur, but by arguments. Rome invented the tribunate to give plebeians a voice, only to have those tribunes threatened, bribed, or occasionally murdered when their voices became inconvenient. They established the office of censor to keep track of citizens and their property, but in the hands of ambitious men, it became a weapon to shame rivals. Even the idea of codified law, the 12 tables, hammered out in the 5th century BCE after plebeian protests, was less a shining declaration of rights than a grudging list of rules written to stop the rich from constantly moving the goalposts. The 12 tables included such gems as the right of creditors to chain debtors in their houses and the permission to kill a deformed child. It was justice in the Roman sense, explicit, brutal, and always tilted toward those with means. This was the birth of what Romans proudly called res publica, the public thing. Yet the public part often seemed optional. Consuls waged wars to glorify their names, senators feuded endlessly, and the plebeians learned that their supposed freedom consisted mostly of being trampled more politely. Political life in Rome was not about ideology, but about survival and prestige. Men ran for office not because they dreamed of good governance, but because magistracies provided access to wealth, command, and the chance to carve one's name into history, or at least onto a triumphal arch. Rome's version of democracy was less the rule of the people than the rule of procedure, a dense machinery of vetoes and compromises that ensured decisions were rarely made cleanly. It was a system designed for stalemate, yet also for endurance. Kings could be assassinated, but committees could drag on forever. Of course, the Republic did not exist in isolation. Its neighbours, Etruscans, Latins, Volsci and Sabines, watched Rome's transition with a mix of suspicion and opportunity. Tarquin the Proud, exiled and furious, sought allies to reclaim his throne. The Etruscan king Lars Porsena marched on Rome in Tarquin's name, bringing with him the threat of siege. Here, Roman legend once again embroidered reality. It told of Horatius Cocles, a one-eyed soldier who supposedly held off the entire Etruscan army at the Sublician Bridge, single-handedly defending Rome until his comrades cut the bridge down behind him. Whether this act of suicidal bravery happened or not, the story reveals how Romans wanted to think of themselves, citizens defending liberty against tyranny, one body at a time. What mattered less was that Porsena may actually have taken the city, and that Rome had to negotiate its freedom afterward. The myth was cleaner, more inspiring, and infinitely more useful as propaganda. Even in these early decades, the Republic showed its peculiar genius for transforming failure into legend. Losses became noble sacrifices, defeats were rebranded as moral victories, and every humiliation was recast as a temporary setback on the road to destiny. When soldiers starved in the field because the Senate refused to fund proper supplies, the story became one of rustic toughness. When plebeians rioted over debt and threatened to secede from the city entirely, Rome spun it into the birth of new offices, a sign of healthy balance. The Republic excelled at taking chaos and dressing it up as order. What it could not do, however, was deliver genuine stability. The patrician-plebeian divide grew sharper with each passing year. Wealthy landowners seized territory, leaving small farmers destitute. The plebeians demanded relief, threatening mutiny within the legions that Rome needed to defend itself. The patricians responded with grudging concessions, such as allowing plebeians to elect their own tribunes, men empowered to veto decisions harmful to their class. But every concession brought new conflict. Plebeians pushed for equality in marriage, access to magistracies, and relief from crushing debts, while patricians fought tooth and nail to preserve their privileges. The Republic became an arena where reforms were proposed, resisted, half-implemented, and often drowned in blood. Rome called this the struggle of the orders, but it might better be described as a centuries-long tug-of-war in which neither side ever truly won, and everyone went home bruised. Yet even as Rome wrestled with itself, it could not ignore the world beyond its walls. Wars with neighbours broke out with monotonous regularity. Some were defensive, others opportunistic, but nearly all were brutal. Rome relied on its citizen soldiers, men who were expected to farm their land in peacetime, and then march to war whenever called. Campaigns often lasted months, leaving fields untended and families impoverished. Victories enriched the generals and their senatorial patrons, while defeats simply demanded more bodies the following season. The Republic justified this as survival, but the cycle of endless war became a habit that would define Roman identity. Peace was treated less as a goal than as an intermission between conflicts. The irony of Rome's so-called freedom is that it was always tied to obligation. Citizens boasted that they were not subjects of a king, yet they were subject to conscription, taxation, and the whims of aristocrats who viewed them as fodder. A farmer might vote in the assemblies, but his voice carried little weight compared to the coordinated power of the patrician blocks. In practice, the Republic functioned less like a democracy and more like a game of aristocratic musical chairs, with offices rotated among the same names while the masses shouldered the cost. The Romans accepted this not because it was fair, but because it seemed preferable to the memory of tyranny. Kingship had become a dirty word, and so long as no man wore a crown, the citizens could convince themselves they were free. Still, the Republic's machinery worked just well enough to keep the city alive. The two consuls provided checks on each other's ambition, even if that meant paralysis. The Senate offered a storehouse of experience, even if most of that experience was devoted to self-interest. The tribunes gave plebeians a voice, even if those tribunes were often silenced. The 12 tables offered law, even if that law was harsh and unequal. It was a system defined not by justice, but by endurance, capable of absorbing outrage, smoothing over crises, and stumbling forward into the next disaster without collapsing entirely. That peculiar resilience would carry Rome through centuries of upheaval, though at the cost of endless frustration. By the end of the 6th and into the 5th century BCE, Rome was firmly established as a republic. Not a monarchy, not yet an empire, but something in between. The young republic congratulated itself on having escaped the tyranny of kings. But kings were never Rome's only problem. Beyond its walls, the Italian peninsula was a patchwork of tribes and city-states, all vying for dominance, and Rome was merely one more contestant in this crowded brawl. The Etruscans to the north were wealthier and more sophisticated, their cities filled with art, engineering, and a sense of style Rome lacked. The Samnites in the central hills were fierce, resilient warriors who treated mountain fighting as second nature. Even the Latins, Rome's supposed kin, were not above conspiring against their ambitious cousin. In its early centuries, Rome was less a master of Italy than a scrappy participant in constant border skirmishes, always one defeat away from collapse, and one lucky alliance away from survival. The Republic's leaders boasted of liberty, but in practice most of their energy went into drafting young men to march out each summer against whoever had most recently raided their fields. The wars against the Etruscans set the tone for these early struggles. The Etruscan city of Veii, just a few miles from Rome, became both rival and obsession. Veii was wealthier, older, and more secure, with walls that mocked Rome's pretensions to greatness. For decades, the two cities fought over territory, livestock, and honour. Roman historians, writing long after the fact, embroidered the wars with dramatic episodes, the heroism of generals, the intervention of gods, the occasional betrayal. What matters is that Rome did not win quickly. Veii was finally taken only after a brutal siege in 396 BCE, supposedly lasting 10 years, as though Rome wished to echo the grandeur of Troy. When Veii fell, its population was enslaved, its treasures carted back to Rome, and its gods invited, politely or not, to migrate to Rome's temples. Conquest became assimilation, and Rome learned a lesson it would repeat endlessly. If you cannot just destroy your neighbour, absorb them, plunder their culture, and pretend it was yours all along. If Veii demonstrated Rome's persistence, the Samnite Wars exposed its limitations. The Samnites were hardy hill fighters who excelled at ambushes and rough terrain, everything the rigid Roman legions hated. Rome's armies, drilled for open-field battles and grand speeches before the clash, were forced to crawl through ravines and mountain passes where discipline counted for less than familiarity with goat paths. The humiliating episode at the Caudine Forks in 321 BCE showed the world that Rome's so-called destiny could be reduced to farce. Trapped by Samnite forces in a narrow valley, the Roman legions were forced to surrender without a fight. As part of the ritual humiliation, soldiers were made to pass beneath a yoke of spears, bent double like cattle being herded to slaughter. To Romans who prided themselves on dignity and gravitas, it was an unbearable disgrace. Yet even in humiliation, Rome found narrative advantage. The disaster was reframed as a temporary blemish on an otherwise noble struggle, and the Republic threw itself back into the war until eventually, through sheer attrition, the Samnites were worn down. Rome did not win because it was better. but because it refused to stop. Yet the greatest humiliation of all came not from a sophisticated rival or a mountain tribe, but from barbarians the Romans scarcely considered worth their notice. In 390 BCE, or perhaps a few years earlier, depending on which source you believe, a band of Gauls swept down from the north under a chieftain named Brennus. These were not the civilized enemies Romans liked to imagine themselves against. They were painted warriors with wild hair, loud voices, and a terrifying indifference to Roman concepts of order. At the river Allia, not far from the city itself, the Roman army was annihilated. Survivors fled in panic, and Brennus' men marched into Rome almost unopposed. The city was looted and burned, its temples desecrated, its citizens slaughtered or enslaved. The Capitol Hill held out for a time, defended by desperate Romans who barricaded themselves behind walls, but the rest of the city became a charred ruin. Rome's proud talk of liberty and destiny dissolved overnight into the reality of smoking rubble. Roman legend, unwilling to leave even disaster unadorned, inserted moments of theatrical defiance into the catastrophe. One story claimed that when the Gauls stormed the capital at night, the sacred geese of Juno shrieked loudly enough to wake the defenders, who then drove the invaders back. Another tale told of Marcus Manlius, who supposedly fought off the Gauls single-handedly until his comrades arrived. These anecdotes, whether true or not, allowed Romans to imagine dignity within disaster. But the humiliation remained undeniable. The city had been ransomed back, not won. Brennus, according to legend, threw his sword onto the scales. When weighing out the gold, Rome paid for peace, sneering vae victis, woe to the vanquished. The phrase burned into Roman memory, a reminder that no amount of rhetoric could disguise the fact that they had been utterly defeated. The aftermath of the sack scarred Rome's psyche for centuries. Archaeological evidence suggests parts of the city were indeed rebuilt hastily after widespread destruction, though perhaps not every corner had been burned as the stories claim. Regardless, Romans remembered it as the lowest point in their history, a moment of shame that demanded eternal recompense. Later historians, eager to glorify Rome, would insist the city rose stronger from the ashes, hardened by disaster into the steel that would one day conquer the world. Yet beneath the rhetoric lies a simpler truth. Rome survived because the Gauls left, not because of any hidden strength. Brennus had achieved what he wanted, plunder and humiliation, and moved on. The Republic remained because its enemies were not interested in permanent occupation. Rome would cling to this narrow escape as both trauma and inspiration, shaping its foreign policy for generations. The sack also reshaped Roman attitudes toward defense. No longer would they rely on natural terrain or divine favor. They would build walls, fortifications, and legions large enough to ensure such a humiliation could never happen again. The Servian wall, reconstructed and expanded in the aftermath, symbolized this paranoia, encircling the city with stone as though mass masonry could erase the memory of fire. Every war afterward carried the ghost of 390 BCE. When Rome crushed a rival, it was not just about expansion, but about proving to itself and to the world that it would never again be forced to watch its temples burn and its citizens beg for mercy. The Republic's relentless aggression, often framed as destiny, was in truth born of fear. Expansion became the only guarantee of survival. Weakness had already been tested, and the result was humiliation. Even Rome's culture of storytelling reflected this obsession. Children were told of the sacred geese who saved the capital, of Brennus' cruel sneer, of the ashes from which their ancestors had risen. These tales hardened into a national narrative. Romans might be defeated, but they would never stop. Each disaster became fuel for the next campaign, every humiliation an excuse for another round of conquest. The sack by the Gauls was not forgotten even centuries later, when Caesar marched into Gaul, when emperors boasted of crushing northern tribes. The shadow of Brennus was always there. Rome's destiny, if one can call it that, was less about glory and more about avenging a shame that had once brought it to its knees. By the end of the 4th century BCE, Rome was no longer simply a city that had thrown off kings. It was a republic, scarred by defeat and determined to define itself through conquest. The wars with Etruscans and Samnites had taught endurance. The sack by the Gauls had etched fear into its bones. Together, they produced a Rome that equated safety with aggression, liberty with domination, survival with preemptive war. From this point forward, Rome would not be content to defend its walls. It would march outward, carrying its anxieties into every neighbour's territory. The vow was simple. Never again would Rome allow itself to be humiliated. Never again would its enemies dictate terms. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome's appetite for survival had morphed into an appetite for expansion, and sooner or later it was bound to collide with another power that had drawn the same conclusion. That rival was Carthage, a wealthy trading empire on the coast of North Africa. Where Rome had grown out of mud huts and grudges, Carthage had been founded by Phoenician settlers and built its wealth on trade routes, harbours, and a navy that dominated the western Mediterranean. Rome considered itself a land power, its strength in the stubborn discipline of its legions. Carthage, by contrast, had ships, silver, and centuries of experience on the sea. When a dispute over the island of Sicily dragged both powers into conflict in 264 BCE, the stage was set for the longest and most exhausting war either state had ever known. The Romans would call it the First Punic War, though there was nothing first about it at the time. For those who lived through it, it was simply a generation spent drowning in salt water and debt. The conflict began, as Roman conflicts so often did, with a local squabble inflated into existential struggle. A band of mercenaries called the Mamertines had seized the city of Messana in Sicily and found themselves squeezed between the Carthaginians on one side and Syracuse on the other. In desperation, they appealed to Rome for aid. The Senate hesitated. Intervening in Sicily would mean crossing the sea, something Romans had never done on a large scale, but hesitation never lasted long in Rome. Honour, opportunity, and paranoia all pointed in the same direction. If Carthage gained too much control of Sicily, Rome would be hemmed in. The decision was made. Rome marched to war not only against Carthage, but against its own inexperience. There was one small problem. Rome had no navy. Carthage, meanwhile, had hundreds of warships and a long tradition of seamanship. For Rome to challenge Carthage on the water was like asking a farmer to wrestle a dolphin. Yet in typical Roman fashion, they decided ignorance was no obstacle. Captured Carthaginian ships were studied, copied, and reproduced en masse in Roman shipyards. The legend insists that Rome built its first fleet of more than 100 ships in just 60 days, an achievement that sounds less like history than mania. The problem was that building ships is not the same as sailing them. Roman crews recruited from farmers and citizens with no experience on the sea capsized themselves with impressive regularity. It was as though the Republic had discovered an entirely new way to kill its own soldiers, not by enemy spears, but by drowning. Rome's solution was characteristically brutal. Instead of learning to sail better, they bolted ramps and boarding bridges, corvée or crows, onto their ships. When a Roman vessel drew alongside an enemy, the ramp would drop, and soldiers would rush across to turn a naval battle into a land battle. It was ingenious in a way that only desperation produces. Carthage's sailors might outmaneuver Roman ships with ease, but once the vessels locked together, it became another contest of infantry, and Roman infantry had centuries of practice in butchery. Of course, this innovation did not stop storms from tearing Roman fleets apart. Dozens of times, entire flotillas sank in sudden squalls, their men dragged into the sea by the very equipment meant to save them. More Romans drowned in the First Punic War than were ever killed by Carthaginian steel, a fact that must have made Neptune the true victor of the conflict. The war dragged on for over 2 decades, an absurd length of time for what had begun as a squabble over Sicily. Battles on land seesawed without conclusion. In 256 BCE, Rome attempted a grand invasion of North Africa, hoping to strike Carthage directly. At first, it looked promising. Roman forces landed, won victories, and threatened the city itself. But then fortune shifted, as it always did. Carthaginian counterattacks, aided by mercenary cavalry, shattered the Roman army, and only a handful of survivors limped back to Italy. Meanwhile, at sea, storm after storm, sank fleets that had cost staggering sums to build. Senators must have wondered whether Sicily was worth the expense, yet pride prevented withdrawal. Once Rome committed to a war, it did not stop, no matter how ruinous the costs. On Sicily, the struggle became one of attrition. Cities were besieged, grain fields burned, and populations starved into submission. Roman and Carthaginian armies circled each other for years, neither side able to deliver a knockout blow. The war's most famous general, Hamilcar Barca, father of the future Hannibal, fought a guerrilla campaign, harassing Roman positions and keeping the fight alive long after Carthage had lost the stomach for major offensives. It was a war of stalemate and exhaustion, where victories meant little more than the opportunity to fight another day. The true casualties were the Sicilian people, trapped between 2 predators, tearing at each other's throats while their land was trampled to ruin. Eventually, sheer stubbornness tilted the balance. Rome poured resources into yet another fleet, this time funded not by the treasury but by private contributions from wealthy citizens, as if national survival had been passed around like a collection plate. In 241 BCE, this new fleet cornered the Carthaginians at the Battle of the Aegates Islands. By then, Rome had learned enough seamanship to avoid embarrassing itself, and Carthage, exhausted and nearly bankrupt, could no longer afford to risk its best ships. The Roman victory was decisive, cutting off Carthage's supply lines and forcing it to sue for peace. After 23 years of fighting, Sicily was ceded to Rome. The Republic had achieved its first overseas province, transforming itself from an Italian power into a Mediterranean one. Yet this triumph was anything but glorious. The war had drained Rome's coffers, depopulated its countryside, and littered the sea floor with its drowned sons. The Republic did not win through genius or skill, but through endurance, refusing to accept defeat, no matter how many disasters piled up. Victory by attrition became a Roman specialty, and the lesson was seared into their identity. They might lose battles, but they would not lose wars so long as they were willing to sacrifice endlessly. It was a strategy that would carry them to greatness and also to ruin. For Carthage, the humiliation was bitter. Losing Sicily was not just a loss of territory, but of prestige and profit. Carthage had long considered itself master of the Western Mediterranean. Now it was forced to watch Rome, a former backwater of farmers, seize the role of rising hegemon. The peace terms demanded heavy indemnities, draining Carthage's treasury for years to come. Resentment simmered, especially in the Barca family, where young Hannibal grew up under the shadow of Rome's victory and his father's unfinished war. If Rome believed that defeating Carthage once meant the matter was settled, they were deluding themselves. All they had done was plant the seed of vengeance, a seed that would march across the Alps in the form of elephants and nearly bring the Republic to its knees. The First Punic War ended in Roman victory, but it was the kind of victory that left everyone poorer, angrier, and more determined for the next round. Sicily was now Roman, but Carthage was not defeated in spirit. The Mediterranean had room for only one great power, and both sides knew the struggle was far from finished. Rome had won the first contest, but Carthage would not forgive, and the Republic would soon discover that its hardest war was yet to come. If the First Punic War had been a grim marathon of drowning sailors and battered fleets, the Second Punic War was an opera of terror. Its central figure was Hannibal Barca, a Carthaginian general raised on the bitterness of Carthage's humiliation. As a child, he had been brought before an altar and sworn never to be a friend to Rome. The oath was more than symbolic. It was generational revenge, sharpened into strategy. When Hannibal marched his army from Spain toward Italy in 218 BCE, Rome expected another routine border war. What it received instead was a campaign so audacious, so devastating, that it would haunt the Republic for decades and nearly erase it from history. The centerpiece of Hannibal's plan was a march that seemed impossible, leading tens of thousands of soldiers, horses, and war elephants over the Alps. For Romans, the Alps were a natural fortress, a barrier between Italy and the chaos beyond. To Hannibal, they were an obstacle, not a wall. The crossing was a nightmare of snow, avalanches, hostile tribes, and sheer cliffs. Men froze, elephants slipped to their deaths, and supplies vanished into the mountainside. By any normal calculation, the expedition should have ended in disaster. But Hannibal emerged on the Italian side with enough troops to begin tearing through Roman armies. His survival of the Alps was not just a military feat, it was psychological warfare. Rome's citizens looked north and realized that their worst enemy had marched straight into their backyard, bringing with him beasts that looked like monsters pulled from myth. The early battles were a cascade of humiliation for Rome. At the Trebia River, Hannibal baited the Romans into crossing icy water and then crushed them with cavalry. At Lake Trasimene, he staged one of the largest ambushes in history, trapping an entire Roman army between the lake and his hidden forces, killing or capturing tens of thousands. Roman soldiers drowned in panic, their armour dragging them under, while survivors were hunted through the fog. These were not just defeats, they were annihilations, and each one drove the knife deeper into Rome's pride. The Republic, accustomed to bullying neighbours, now found itself stalked like prey. But the disaster at Cannae in 216 BCE eclipsed them all. Hannibal faced a Roman force nearly double the size of his own, commanded by consuls who were determined to finally crush him. What followed was a slaughter written into military textbooks for centuries. Hannibal arranged his troops in a crescent formation, drawing the Romans in until they pressed against his centre. Then his cavalry smashed into their flanks and rear, encircling the entire Roman army. It was a perfect trap. As many as 50,000 Romans died in a single day, packed so tightly that men could not swing swords, crushed underfoot as their comrades fell. Livy would later describe soldiers suffocating in piles of bodies, unable even to raise arms in defence. For Rome, it was not just a loss, but an existential horror. An entire generation of its fighting men had been extinguished in the dust of southern Italy. In the aftermath, Rome teetered on collapse. Allies defected to Hannibal, cities opened their gates, and the Republic's confidence evaporated. Panic rippled through the capital. There were reports of human sacrifices, desperate attempts to appease the gods who seemed to have abandoned their city. Senators ordered prayers, rituals, and the consultation of every available oracle, but no divine intervention came. For nearly 2 decades, Hannibal roamed Italy, a shadow over the land, his army living off plunder, his presence a constant reminder of Roman vulnerability. Each year the Republic scraped together new legions, sent them out, and watched them die or desert. It was a slow bleed, a nightmare without end, and for many Romans it must have felt as though the gods had finally revoked their city's claim to eternity. And yet Rome endured, not through brilliance or sudden reversal, but through its old, miserable strength, attrition. The Republic refused to negotiate, refused to surrender, refused even to acknowledge the possibility of peace while Hannibal still breathed. They appointed Fabius Maximus as dictator, remembered as the cunctator, the delayer, who wisely avoided pitched battles and instead harassed Hannibal's forces, cutting supply lines and wearing him down. His strategy was mocked at the time. Romans preferred heroic clashes, but it prevented more catastrophic defeats. Slowly, painfully, the tide began to shift. Hannibal's army, far from home and without steady reinforcements, found itself trapped in Italy, winning battles but losing the war of endurance. Meanwhile, Rome adapted. New generals rose, among them Publius Cornelius Scipio, who would later be called Scipio Africanus. Unlike his predecessors, Scipio understood that to defeat Hannibal, Rome had to widen the battlefield. He campaigned successfully in Spain, cutting Carthage off from its richest territory, and then carried the war into North Africa itself. By 202 BCE, the tables had turned. Hannibal, summoned back to defend Carthage, faced Scipio at the Battle of Zama. This time, the cavalry advantage was Rome's, and Hannibal's elephants, once symbols of terror, panicked under javelin fire and trampled their own lines. The battle ended in Carthaginian defeat, and with it, the long nightmare of Hannibal's Italian campaign finally ended. Rome's terms of victory were predictably brutal. Carthage was forced to surrender its navy, pay massive indemnities, and accept restrictions that crippled its ability to wage future wars. Hannibal himself fled into exile, a man who had once terrified a continent reduced to wandering between foreign courts, plotting futile schemes of revenge. Yet for all the triumph Rome claimed, the victory was not absolute. Carthage still existed, weakened but alive. Its ports still bustled with trade, its people still remembered the humiliation. And in the Roman imagination, that was intolerable. Rome had learned from the Gallic sack that an enemy left standing would always return. Carthage, though beaten, remained a spectre. The Second Punic War left scars on both civilizations. Italy was devastated, its fields burned, its population drained by endless levies. Rome's manpower losses were staggering, forcing the Republic to lower age limits for soldiers and conscript men who would once have been spared. Carthage, for its part, was shackled by debt and resentment, its pride shattered but not erased. The war had lasted nearly 20 years, shaping a generation on both sides. For the Romans who survived, it proved that their republic could withstand anything, so long as they were willing to bleed enough. For Carthaginians, it proved that Rome's hatred was unyielding, and that humiliation was only a prelude to worse. The legend of Hannibal endured long after his exile. Roman parents frightened their children with the phrase "Hannibal at the gates," a boogeyman, to remind them that enemies were never far away. Generals studied his tactics, even as they congratulated themselves on outlasting him. Hannibal himself became a paradox, admired for genius, hated for what he had done to Rome. The Alps, the elephants, Cannae. These episodes became part of Roman identity, reminders of how close they had come to annihilation. and how much they had endured to avoid it. Rome survived, but survival came with a lesson. Any rival capable of inflicting such terror could never be left alive for long. Rome's victory in the Second Punic War left Carthage hobbled but not destroyed, and that was always going to be a problem. The Republic had survived Hannibal's elephants and his endless ambushes, but the very fact that Carthage still existed as a functioning city gnawed at Roman pride. Sicily was theirs, Spain was theirs, and Carthage had been stripped of its navy and forced into debt. Yet for Rome, this was not enough. To the Roman mind, an enemy permitted to live was an enemy already preparing revenge. Carthage traded, rebuilt, and paid its indemnities on time, but prosperity itself was treated as a provocation. In the Senate, men like Cato the Elder ended every speech, no matter the subject, with the same refrain: Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. It became less a policy debate than a mantra, a whispered compulsion that grew louder with each passing year. The official cause of war was predictably flimsy. Carthage, hemmed in by the treaty restrictions, found itself threatened by Numidia, a Roman ally next door. When Carthage fought back without Roman permission, the Senate seized its excuse. This was framed not as aggression, but as preemptive justice, as though Rome were the world's policeman and Carthage a delinquent child. In truth, Rome wanted an excuse to finish what Hannibal had started and failed to achieve, the end of Carthage itself. And so in 149 BCE, the Third Punic War began, not as a contest of equals, but as a slow strangulation of a weakened rival. The war was less a clash of armies than a prolonged siege. Roman legions marched into Africa and surrounded Carthage, cutting it off by land and sea. The Carthaginians, desperate, fortified their city and prepared for the long starvation ahead. What followed was not the kind of glamorous battle Romans liked to inscribe on triumphal arches, but the grinding misery of urban siege warfare. Citizens melted down jewellery to pay for weapons, children scavenged scraps in alleys, and disease spread through crowded quarters. Carthage had once been a city of trade and wealth, a hub of commerce linking Africa, Spain, and the Mediterranean. Now it was reduced to a starving fortress, waiting for the inevitable breach. For Rome, the siege became a theatre of cruelty. Scipio Aemilianus, grandson by adoption of Scipio Africanus, took command and turned the war into a personal performance of vengeance. He tightened the noose around the city, building walls around the walls, ensuring no one could escape. Carthaginian attempts to break the blockade were crushed. Starvation set in, and reports of cannibalism crept into the accounts, the final stage of any desperate siege. When the Romans finally breached the defences, in 146 BCE, what followed was not victory, but butchery. Street by street, house by house, the legions advanced, slaughtering civilians, burning temples, and cutting down anyone who resisted. Carthage was not defeated, it was erased. The slaughter lasted for days. Ancient writers describe flames consuming entire districts, women and children dragged into slavery, and the streets piled with corpses. The Temple of Eshmun, one of Carthage's most sacred sites, became a final redoubt, its defenders fighting until the flames consumed them. Even in surrender, Carthage was denied dignity. Survivors were herded into chains, shipped off as human cargo, their city dismantled brick by brick. Rome had not come to defeat Carthage, but to annihilate it, and it succeeded with ruthless efficiency. When the smoke cleared, Carthage was gone. The Republic had destroyed a civilization and called it peace. The myth that followed was almost as grotesque as the act itself. Later, Roman writers claimed that the ground was salted so that nothing could grow, a symbolic act of sterilization. Whether this literally happened is debated by historians, but the symbolism mattered more than the fact. Rome wanted the world to know that Carthage had not just lost, it had been unmade, stripped of any future. The land that had once supported a thriving empire was reduced to rubble, its people scattered, its memory curated only by the conqueror. In salting the earth, Rome salted its own conscience, turning annihilation into a performance of necessity. And yet, in destroying Carthage, Rome became the very monster it had once feared. The Republic had been born in the trauma of the Gallic sack, vowing never again to see its walls burned or its citizens enslaved. Now it had done exactly that to another city. It justified this brutality as security, as the price of preventing another Hannibal, but at heart it was vengeance and paranoia made flesh. Rome had crossed the threshold from defender to aggressor, from victim to executioner. The destruction of Carthage revealed what the Republic had truly become, an empire that survived not just on expansion, but on extermination. The psychological toll of this act cannot be overstated. For the Roman citizen, the annihilation of Carthage was a triumph, a sign that their city had conquered destiny itself. Triumphs were celebrated in Rome. Parades marched through the streets. Generals bathed in glory. Yet beneath the applause lurked a truth that could not be denied. The Republic had erased an entire civilization out of fear. Rome's eternity was secured not through virtue or law, but through the slaughter of an enemy that had already been defeated once. It is telling that Roman children would grow up not with stories of Carthaginian trade or temples, but with the simple lesson that enemies must be obliterated. The Republic, once proud of surviving against the odds, now measured itself by the odds it denied to others. The destruction also reshaped the Mediterranean. With Carthage gone, Rome faced no rival in the west. Sicily, Spain, and North Africa all bent under Roman control, their resources feeding the Republic's endless appetite for war. Carthage's fall marked the end of any real competition in the western Mediterranean, leaving Rome free to turn its attention elsewhere. And where else would a restless republic look but east, to the glittering wealth of Greece with its temples, philosophers, and fractious city-states ripe for conquest? Rome had destroyed one empire, but it was not satisfied. The wolf still hungered, and Greece would be its next meal. Thus the Third Punic War ended, not with balance restored, but with the map redrawn. Carthage was a smear of ash, its people scattered into chains, its land reduced to rubble. Rome congratulated itself, declared destiny fulfilled, and marched on, never pausing to consider what had been lost. In erasing Carthage, Rome had silenced a rival, but it had also revealed the depths of its own brutality. It was no longer a city defending itself from annihilation. It was the power that dealt annihilation to others. With Carthage reduced to ashes and the western Mediterranean securely in Roman hands, the Republic turned east, drawn by the glitter of Greek cities and the fractured kingdoms left behind by Alexander the Great. What Rome encountered there was not just wealth, but an entirely different way of life, one that mixed temples and philosophy with the kind of decadence Romans claimed to despise. The wars against Macedon and the Seleucid kings gave Rome an excuse to intervene in Greek affairs, but in practice they were little more than exercises in looting disguised as liberation. Roman generals announced themselves as defenders of Greek freedom, even as their soldiers stripped statues from temples, shipped amphorae of wine back to Italy, and paraded captured philosophers through triumphal processions. Greece was not conquered in one swift blow, but absorbed gradually, through a mixture of alliances, betrayals, and brute force. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, Rome had made Greece a client, and soon enough a province, its treasures flowing westward to adorn villas and temples in Italy. The influx of Greek culture transformed Rome, though not in ways that made it more virtuous. Greek tutors educated Roman children, Greek sculptures filled Roman courtyards, and Greek ideas reshaped Roman thought. Stoicism and Epicureanism, once the debates of philosophers, became fashionable among senators who quoted maxims about virtue while arranging bribes behind closed doors. Greek theatre filled Roman stages, while Greek art filled Roman galleries. Rome liked to tell itself that it remained stern, simple, and austere, but in truth it had been dazzled by the luxury it plundered. Simplicity became harder to defend when marble columns from Athens now lined Roman streets, and delicate frescoes decorated the houses of men who had once claimed to prefer bare walls and wooden benches. With culture came corruption. The conquest of the East brought staggering amounts of wealth into Rome, but the distribution of that wealth was as lopsided as a Roman election. Victorious generals returned with wagons of treasure, new slaves, and titles to lands seized from defeated kings. The Senate grew rich from overseas tribute, and the aristocracy decorated itself in finery while congratulating itself on service to the Republic. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens found their lives shrinking. Wealthy landowners used their new riches to expand estates, buying up farms from veterans ruined by long campaigns abroad. These estates, known as latifundia, were worked by slaves captured in the very wars that had dispossessed Roman farmers. Citizens who had once served as the backbone of the legions were now reduced to unemployment, crowding into Rome itself, where they became restless and dependent on grain handouts to survive. The city groaned under the strain of this transformation. Rome was no longer just a town of citizens managing local affairs. It had become the capital of a Mediterranean empire. Grain had to be imported from Sicily and beyond to feed the swelling population. Riots erupted whenever shipments were delayed or prices rose. Politicians discovered that the urban masses could be bribed with food and entertained with games, a lesson that would harden into the infamous policy of bread and circuses. Gladiatorial shows became larger, races more extravagant, and public feasts more elaborate, all designed to distract citizens from the fact that wealth was concentrating into fewer and fewer hands. Rome had conquered the world, but could not feed its own without theatrics. The sheer volume of slaves pouring into Italy altered society in profound ways. Prisoners from Greece, Asia, and North Africa filled Roman households, quarries, and farms. Some were educated Greeks, employed as tutors and secretaries. Others were chained labourers treated as disposable tools. Slave revolts began to flicker, most famously the uprising in Sicily, that revealed just how volatile this new underclass could be. To the Roman elite, these revolts were an inconvenience, quickly crushed. To the average Roman citizen, they were another sign that their republic was slipping out of their control. A farmer who once believed himself the equal of his neighbour now found himself competing with slave labour and losing. Liberty, once a point of pride, seemed to shrink in meaning with every chained prisoner that marched into Italy. Politics grew more poisonous under the pressure of empire. Governors dispatched to far-flung provinces treated them as personal estates, extorting wealth and returning home with fortunes that dwarfed the incomes of their peers. Corruption trials became spectacles in Rome, not because they curbed greed, but because they offered opportunities for rivals to humiliate one another in public. Senators enriched themselves while condemning luxury in speeches, a hypocrisy so common that no one even pretended to be shocked anymore. Elections were increasingly decided by bribery and spectacle, with candidates spending fortunes to stage games that bought votes. The Republic had set out to conquer others, but it was quietly devouring itself from within. For ordinary Romans, life became a grim paradox. The Republic was richer than ever, yet inequality grew sharper. Veterans returned from years abroad to find their farms seized or destroyed, leaving them to swell the ranks of Rome's urban poor. These men, once proud citizens, now loitered in the forum, unemployed, resentful, and easily roused by demagogues. Grain distributions offered survival, but not dignity. The old Roman virtues of frugality and self-sufficiency rang hollow in a city where marble statues looted from Corinth loomed over beggars, waiting for bread. The Republic, in theory, a system of shared governance, had become a machine for enriching the few and pacifying the many. The irony was not lost on the Romans themselves. Writers like Plautus mocked the obsession with Greek luxury, while stern moralists like Cato thundered against the corruption of old values. But even Cato, who ended every speech with "Carthage must be destroyed," could not resist the Greek tutors in his household. Rome's elite condemned luxury in public and indulged it in private, embodying the hypocrisy that had become the Republic's defining trait. The more they preached austerity, the more extravagantly they lived. The city that had once prided itself on simplicity was now drowning in foreign wealth, and with it came foreign vices. The Republic, flush with conquest, began to resemble the very monarchies it claimed to despise. Senators squabbled not just over policy, but over provinces, each office a gateway to personal enrichment. Rivalries grew sharper, factions hardened, and violence became an acceptable tool of politics. Street gangs formed around wealthy patrons, intimidating opponents and disrupting elections. The illusion of republican equality wore thinner with each passing year, replaced by the blunt reality of oligarchy. Rome had become a superpower, but it was a fragile one, built on the exploitation of its provinces and the alienation of its own citizens. By the late 2nd century BCE, the Republic had become a paradox too large to ignore. Rome controlled an empire stretching from Spain to Greece, its coffers filled with tribute, and its markets flooded with grain, slaves, and silver. Yet within the city itself, discontent festered. The aristocracy enjoyed lavish villas decorated with stolen Greek art, while ordinary Romans crowded into insulae, ramshackle apartment blocks, where fire and collapse were constant risks. Veterans returned from years abroad to find their farms seized by wealthy landowners or worked by slave labour. These dispossessed citizens swelled the ranks of the urban poor, men who had once been Rome's backbone on the battlefield but were now reduced to waiting for handouts and jeering in the forum. The contradiction between Rome's outward strength and its internal weakness was stark, and sooner or later, someone was bound to challenge it. That someone was Tiberius Gracchus. Tiberius was not a radical outsider, but a member of the elite himself, the son of a prominent family, and the grandson of Scipio Africanus. He had served as a soldier and seen firsthand the decay of Rome's small farmers. In 133 BCE, elected as tribune of the plebs, he proposed what seemed to him a modest reform, enforcing old laws that limited how much public land any one person could own. The idea was simple: break up the vast estates, redistribute land to poor citizens, and restore the class of small farmers who had once been the Republic's strength. On paper, it sounded like common sense, a correction rather than a revolution. To the Senate, however, it was heresy. Land was wealth, wealth was power, and power was not something the elite intended to surrender to hungry veterans. The reaction was swift and vicious. Senators accused Tiberius of plotting tyranny, of seeking to crown himself king under the guise of reform. They delayed his proposals, blocked funding, and used every procedural trick to strangle his law. Tiberius fought back with equal determination. He bypassed the Senate and appealed directly to the popular assembly, enraging the aristocracy. He even sought re-election as tribune, breaking with tradition in a move that convinced his enemies he meant to make himself permanent ruler. The stage was set not for debate, but for blood. On the day of the vote, a mob of senators led by Scipio Nasica stormed into the assembly armed with clubs, staves, and whatever weapons they could grab from the temple of Jupiter. In the chaos, Tiberius was beaten to death, along with hundreds of his supporters. His body was thrown into the Tiber without ceremony, an irony not lost on anyone who remembered that Rome's first founder had also drowned his brother in that river's shadow. Reform had been proposed, reform had been debated, and reform had been answered with bludgeons. The Republic, supposedly a government of law, had revealed itself instead as a government of panic, willing to slaughter its own tribunes rather than tolerate redistribution. For a brief moment, it looked as though Tiberius's death might end the matter. His reforms were stalled, his supporters silenced, and the Senate congratulated itself on preserving order. But the violence had set a precedent. If politics could be resolved with clubs, then every future reformer would know what to expect. Into this poisoned atmosphere stepped Gaius Gracchus, Tiberius' younger brother, a man more ambitious, more eloquent, and more determined to finish what had been started. Elected tribune in 123 BCE, Gaius launched a sweeping program of reforms. He revived his brother's land redistribution, but added more: subsidized grain for the poor, colonies for resettlement, new courts to check senatorial power, and even proposals to extend citizenship to Rome's Italian allies. His speeches electrified the masses, and his energy seemed unstoppable. For a time it looked as though the Republic might actually tilt toward justice, but every new measure deepened senatorial paranoia. Grain subsidies threatened the elite's profits. Colonies threatened their control of land. New courts threatened their immunity. And citizenship for allies? That was too much. If Italians were granted rights, they might vote, and if they voted, they might dilute the aristocracy's hold on the assemblies. For Rome's ruling class, this was not reform, but treason. The Senate bided its time. When Gaius sought a third term as tribune, his enemies manoeuvred against him, stirring riots and accusing him of plotting tyranny just as they had accused his brother. The tipping point came when one of his supporters clashed with a political opponent, leaving the man dead. The Senate seized the excuse, issuing a Senatus Consultum Ultimum, a so-called ultimate decree that granted consuls unlimited authority to protect the state. It was the first time this emergency power had been invoked, and it would not be the last. Roman soldiers, now acting at the Senate's behest, marched into the city to suppress Gaius and his followers. The fighting was brutal. Gaius fled with a band of supporters to the Aventine Hill, where they prepared to resist. Outnumbered and surrounded, they were cut down. Gaius himself died either by his own hand or at the sword of a pursuer, depending on which version one believes. Thousands of his followers were executed without trial, their bodies piled as warnings. Reform had once again ended in massacre, and the Senate, drenched in blood, congratulated itself on saving the Republic. In truth, it had done the opposite. It had shown that politics was now war by another name. The deaths of the Gracchi brothers marked a turning point in Roman history. Before them, reform had been contested in debate, with violence a rare last resort. After them, violence became an accepted tool of politics. Tribunes were no longer sacred, assemblies were no longer safe. Mobs and soldiers alike could decide the outcome of legislation. The precedent was set that when words failed, fists and swords would suffice. Rome had discovered that killing reformers was easier than conceding to them, and it would repeat the lesson with increasing enthusiasm. The irony is that many of the reforms the Gracchi proposed would eventually be enacted, albeit years later and under different circumstances. Grain distributions, colonies, and land reforms would become part of Rome's political landscape. Yet the Gracchi themselves were remembered not for their policies, but for their deaths. To their supporters, they were martyrs for justice. To their enemies, they were dangerous demagogues rightly crushed. In reality, they were reminders that Rome's republic could no longer adapt peacefully to change. It had grown too rigid, too paranoid, too entrenched in its inequalities to tolerate genuine correction. Reform had become synonymous with civil strife, and the streets of Rome would pay the price. By murdering the Gracchi, the Senate won temporary security but lost its legitimacy. The common people learned that the institutions supposedly designed to protect them would never willingly yield to justice. The aristocracy learned that violence worked, that clubs and swords were faster than arguments. Future generals and politicians learned the same lesson. If reform could be blocked by assassination, then why not ambition as well? The Republic, always proud of its laws, had quietly normalized lawlessness, provided it served the right class. The stage was now set for the next act of Roman history. Political violence had broken the taboo. Senators had bloodied their hands in the forum, and citizens had seen tribunes cut down like common rioters. From this point forward, ambition would sharpen. Generals would eye the city itself as a prize, and the Republic would stagger ever closer to collapse. The Gracchi brothers had tried to heal Rome's inequality. Instead, their corpses became milestones on the road to civil war. Violence in politics was no longer an aberration. It was the new normal, and Rome's future would not be shaped by statesmen, but by generals. Men who discovered that legions were far more persuasive than speeches. The first of these was Gaius Marius, a man whose career embodied both Roman ambition and Roman desperation. Born into a relatively obscure family in the town of Arpinum, Marius clawed his way into prominence through military service, rather than noble lineage. By the end of the 2nd century BCE, Rome was locked in wars against the Numidians in North Africa, and more alarmingly, against migrating tribes of Cimbri and Teutones who were smashing Roman armies in Gaul. The Republic, battered and humiliated, needed a saviour, and Marius presented himself as one. His great innovation was not a brilliant tactic or a stunning victory, but a reform of the army itself. Before Marius, Roman soldiers were drawn primarily from property-owning citizens. Service was both a duty and a privilege, tied to land and class. But decades of war and the growth of aristocratic estates had eroded this base. Fewer farmers owned land, and fewer men qualified for service under the old rules. Marius solved this by recruiting the capite censi, the head count, the poorest citizens with no property at all. He offered them pay, equipment, and the promise of land upon retirement. The result was a professional army, loyal not to the Senate or the Republic, but to the general who paid their wages and promised them rewards. In trying to save Rome, Marius had transformed it. The Republic now had soldiers whose allegiance was personal, not civic, and the consequences would be catastrophic. Marius won his wars. He defeated Jugurtha of Numidia and later crushed the Cimbri and Teutones, saving Italy from what looked like imminent invasion. He was hailed as a hero, elected consul an unprecedented 7 times, and celebrated as the man who had preserved the Republic. Yet his reforms, meant to strengthen Rome, had planted a rot at its core. Soldiers no longer fought simply because they were citizens. They fought because they were clients of their commander. Generals could now wield armies as private instruments, and politics would never again be free from the shadow of the sword. The next figure to test this new arrangement was Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a man of patrician birth but ruthless ambition. Sulla served under Marius in the Julio-Claudian War, but their partnership quickly soured. When war broke out against Mithridates of Pontus in the east, both men vied for command. The Senate granted it to Sulla, but Marius used his influence with the assemblies to overturn the decision. Sulla responded with something unthinkable. He marched his legions on Rome itself. The sight of Roman soldiers advancing through their own streets was a line crossed that could never be uncrossed. Rome had faced foreign invaders and barbarian hordes, but now its greatest threat was its own army. Sulla's coup succeeded, Marius fled, and the Republic learned that whoever controlled the legions controlled the city. But Rome was a place where revenge was always guaranteed. While Sulla marched east to fight Mithridates, Marius returned with his supporters and unleashed a reign of terror. Political enemies were slaughtered, houses burned, and the Forum once again ran red. Marius, old and ailing, died soon after his 7th consulship, but his violence set the stage for more. When Sulla returned from the east, victorious and bitter, he repeated the process on an even larger scale. He marched on Rome again, crushed his opponents, and declared himself dictator, not for the usual 6 months allowed by tradition, but indefinitely. The Republic had slipped fully into autocracy, its laws a costume worn by men with swords. Sulla's dictatorship was a grotesque mixture of reform and massacre. On the one hand, he rewrote laws to strengthen the Senate and weaken the tribunes, ensuring that no one, like the Gracchi, could again challenge aristocratic dominance. On the other hand, he indulged in the infamous proscriptions, lists of enemies posted publicly, whose names marked them for death. Anyone could kill the proscribed without consequence, and their property was confiscated for the state, or more often, for Sulla's friends. The Forum became a marketplace of corpses, heads mounted on spikes to decorate the rostra, families ruined overnight by the stroke of a pen. Men settled old grudges by ensuring their rivals' names appeared on the lists. The Republic had turned assassination into administration, murder into policy. Sulla eventually stepped down, astonishingly enough, retiring to private life, as though he had merely taken an extended holiday in dictatorship. But the damage was done. His example proved that absolute power could be seized, exercised, and relinquished with impunity. Every ambitious Roman watching learned the same lesson. If you had the soldiers, you could take the city, and once taken, you could reshape the Republic however you pleased. Sulla had normalized civil war, codified political murder, and left Rome more fragile than when he found it. The years that followed were marked by instability and opportunism. Ambitious men jostled for power, each with their own armies, each convinced they could be the next Sulla. Street violence between rival gangs became common, with figures like Publius Clodius Pulcher organizing mobs to intimidate opponents. Senators debated less about policy and more about which faction could muster the larger force outside the chamber. Rome still held elections, still passed laws, still pretended to be a republic, but the facade was cracking. Behind the rituals lay the reality that violence decided outcomes, not votes. It was in this environment that young generals began to rise, men like Pompey and Crassus, who built reputations through military command and immense wealth. Pompey, nicknamed Magnus for his supposed greatness, won victories in Spain and against the pirates who infested the Mediterranean. Crassus, one of the richest men in Rome, gained fame for crushing the slave revolt of Spartacus, crucifying thousands along the Appian Way as a grotesque warning. Both men represented the new normal, generals as politicians, politics as warfare, and the Republic as spoils to be divided among the strong. And then, in the midst of this blood-soaked stage, another figure emerged, combining the ambition of Marius, the ruthlessness of Sulla, and the charisma to outshine them all. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar. He would inherit the lessons of the Gracchi, Marius, and Sulla, and he would carry them to their logical conclusion. The Republic, already staggering under the weight of armies turned inward, was about to meet the most ambitious general of them all. Caesar's rise was greased by alliances, money, and relentless ambition. In 60 BCE, he joined forces with Pompey the Great, Rome's most celebrated general, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, its richest man, in what became known as the First Triumvirate. The arrangement was unofficial, a private pact to dominate Roman politics by pooling influence. Pompey provided prestige, Crassus provided wealth, and Caesar provided political cunning. Together they reduced the Senate to an audience, while elections became mere formalities. The Republic, supposedly a system of checks and balances, was now little more than a consortium of oligarchs. Yet alliances in Rome rarely lasted, and Caesar was already plotting how to outshine his partners. His opportunity came in the north, in the vast, restless land of Gaul. Appointed governor of several provinces along the Gallic frontier, Caesar turned what might have been a routine administrative post into a launching pad for conquest. Over the course of nearly a decade, he waged war across Gaul from the Rhine to the Atlantic, slaughtering tribes, enslaving populations, and sending endless streams of plunder back to Rome. His commentaries on the Gallic War, carefully written and distributed, portrayed these campaigns as defensive wars, noble efforts to protect Rome from barbarian incursions. In reality, they were aggressive conquests that killed hundreds of thousands and depopulated entire regions. Caesar's legions built bridges over rivers in days, stormed fortified settlements, and crushed resistance with pitiless efficiency. Each victory enhanced his glory, each massacre fattened his purse, and each slave caravan reminded Rome that its general in the north was not merely governing, but remaking the map. The climax of his Gallic wars came at the siege of Alesia in 52 BCE, where Caesar encircled the forces of Vercingetorix, a Gallic chieftain who had briefly united the tribes in resistance. Caesar's army built massive fortifications around the city, then another ring of defences facing outward to block relieving forces. It was a double wall of wood and ditch, a grotesque monument to logistical obsession. When the relief army finally attacked, Caesar's legions fought on both fronts simultaneously, slaughtering attackers outside while starving defenders inside. Alesia fell, Vercingetorix surrendered, and Gaul was effectively broken. Caesar returned to Italy, not as a provincial governor, but as the man who had delivered Rome, an empire at the cost of rivers of blood. The consequences of this conquest went beyond territory. Caesar's legions were no longer just soldiers. They were veterans who had marched with him for years, bound to him by shared plunder, loyalty, and the promise of land. They owed their fortunes to Caesar, not the Senate, and their allegiance was personal rather than civic. It was the nightmare Sulla had first unleashed, now perfected. Caesar could look at his legions and know that they would follow him anywhere, even against Rome itself. The Senate, watching uneasily, understood this too. The Republic had created a monster, and it was marching under Caesar's banner. The uneasy balance of the triumvirate collapsed with time. Crassus was killed in a disastrous campaign against the Parthians. His severed head allegedly used as a stage prop in a play at the enemy court. Pompey, once Caesar's ally, drifted toward the Senate, alarmed at Caesar's growing power. The alliance turned into rivalry, and rivalry into open hostility. In 49 BCE, the Senate, under Pompey's influence, demanded that Caesar disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. To comply would mean political oblivion, even prosecution. To refuse would mean civil war. Caesar, never one to accept humiliation, chose war. At the Rubicon River, the boundary of his command, he crossed with his legions, uttering the line that history has polished into destiny. Alia jacta est. The die is cast. In truth, it was less a gamble than a certainty. Caesar knew the Republic could no longer contain him. What followed was another round of Roman civil war, but this one carried an inevitability the others had lacked. Pompey fled to Greece, gathering forces, while Caesar marched unopposed into Italy, welcomed by cities that saw him as a champion of the people. His speed was astonishing. Within months, he had secured Rome, reorganized the state, and pursued Pompey across the Mediterranean. At Pharsalus in 48 BCE, Caesar's smaller army decisively defeated Pompey's larger one, proving once again that loyalty and experience outweighed numbers. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was promptly murdered by a king eager to please Caesar. When Caesar arrived and was presented with Pompey's severed head, he wept. Whether from genuine sorrow, political theatre, or both, no one can say. The Republic's greatest general had been reduced to a trophy, and Caesar stood unchallenged. As dictator, Caesar presented himself not as a tyrant, but as a reformer. He cancelled debts, reformed the calendar, expanded the Senate, and enacted laws to stabilise the provinces. He poured money into public works and distributed land to veterans, securing the loyalty of both soldiers and citizens. His rule was efficient, pragmatic, and in many ways beneficial to Rome's functioning. But the substance of his power could not be ignored. Caesar was not serving the Republic was serving him. He had concentrated authority in his hands, and though he avoided the title of king, he accepted honours that made the distinction meaningless. Statues of Caesar were placed alongside those of the gods, his portrait appeared on coins, and his seat in the Senate was raised above all others. Rome had supposedly killed its kings centuries earlier, yet here it was again, bowing before a single man. For some, this was salvation. The chaos of the late Republic, the endless feuds, the gang violence, the corruption, seemed finally to have found a solution in Caesar's firm hand. For others, it was the death of liberty. Senators who had tolerated Sulla's dictatorship could not stomach Caesar's permanent dominance, especially as he began to hint at hereditary succession. The Republic's elite, steeped in tradition and paranoia, convinced themselves that Caesar intended to crown himself outright. Rumours swirled of monarchy returning, of Rome's ancient hatred of kingship being resurrected in the form of one ambitious man. The irony was sharp. Caesar's reforms were stabilising the state, but his very success made him intolerable to the men who believed themselves guardians of the Republic. By 44 BCE, Julius Caesar had become too large for the fragile body of the Republic to contain. He had reformed the calendar, redistributed land, reorganised the Senate, and expanded Rome's reach. He had also accepted honours that smelled suspiciously of monarchy. Statues rose in his image, coins carried his face, and the title Dictator for life hung over him like a crown without a diadem. To the people, weary of decades of corruption and violence, Caesar was a saviour who cut through the chaos. To the Senate, he was a disease, proof that liberty had been smothered under the weight of one man's ambition. The irony, of course, was that the senators themselves had spent years degrading the Republic into dysfunction. But in their minds, Caesar was the tyrant, and they were the last defenders of freedom. That contradiction would be resolved not with words, but with knives. The conspiracy formed quietly, whispered among men who believed themselves patriots. Gaius Cassius Longinus, bitter and envious, became one of its ringleaders. Marcus Junius Brutus, descended from the man who had supposedly expelled Rome's last king centuries earlier, was courted with the language of destiny. Others joined, a mixture of idealists, opportunists, and anxious aristocrats who feared that their privileges would be eroded under Caesar's dominance. They named themselves the Liberators, though what they meant to liberate was less the people of Rome than their own political relevance. To them, Caesar was not just a man, he was the shadow of monarchy, the return of the Tarquins, the betrayal of everything the Republic pretended to hold sacred. Rumours swirled as the Ides of March approached. Omens were recorded with obsessive hindsight. Sacrificial animals, found without hearts, dreams of disaster, warnings from prophets. Caesar's wife Calpurnia reportedly begged him not to attend the Senate on that fateful day, unsettled by visions of his statue pouring blood. Caesar, half amused and half dismissive, decided to go anyway. Whether it was arrogance, fatalism, or simply the weight of routine. He brushed aside the warnings. A man who had marched across Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, and crushed Pompey was not about to be cowed by the twitchings of priests. If destiny was waiting, Caesar would meet it on his own terms. The Senate convened on the morning of March 15th, 44 BCE, in the Theatre of Pompey. Ironically enough, the hall built by the very man Caesar had defeated. It was a temporary location, while renovations were underway in the Curia, but the symbolism was thick. Caesar would die beneath the statue of his old rival. As he entered the chamber, senators rose, cloaks draped, daggers hidden beneath their folds. The conspirators surrounded him under the pretense of offering a petition. What followed was chaos compressed into seconds. The first blade struck, then another, and another, until the dictator was engulfed in a storm of steel. Ancient accounts vary on the details, but all agree that Caesar resisted at first, struggling against his attackers, before the sheer weight of the assault overwhelmed him. The figure of Brutus, whether central or merely symbolic, became the most famous. The story insists that Caesar, upon recognizing his supposed friend and ally among the assassins, ceased resisting, uttering the immortal line, "Et tu, Brute," before covering his face with his toga and collapsing beneath the blows. Whether he actually spoke those words is doubtful. Shakespeare's version has echoed louder than any Roman source, but the image stuck. Caesar, betrayed not just by politics but by loyalty, bleeding out beneath the feet of men who claimed to be saving the Republic. When the frenzy ended, he had been stabbed 23 times. His body left sprawled across the Senate floor. Rome's dictator was dead, and liberty, so the conspirators believed, had been restored. What followed was less triumph than confusion. The senators, hands dripping with blood, tried to present themselves as liberators, expecting cheers, acclamation, perhaps even statues of their own. Instead, silence greeted them. The common people, who had benefited from Caesar's reforms and admired his charisma, did not see freedom restored. They saw their champion murdered. The conspirators had killed a man, but failed to kill his memory. They had no plan for what came after. Rome was a city already addicted to strongmen, and removing the strongest of them left a void that no senator could fill. The funeral turned the tide. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant, delivered a eulogy that played the crowd like an instrument. Displaying Caesar's bloodied toga, he reminded the people of their benefactor's generosity, of the lands and money left to them in his will. He pointed to the wounds, naming each conspirator as a murderer, transforming abstract liberty into a visceral betrayal. The crowd erupted in fury, seizing torches and storming the homes of the assassins. Brutus, Cassius, and their allies fled the city they had claimed to save, realizing too late that stabbing Caesar had not resurrected the Republic. It had only inflamed Rome's appetite for vengeance. In the days that followed, the Republic dissolved further into chaos. Caesar's body was burned in the Forum, not with the solemn dignity of a statesman, but with the frantic fervour of a mob. Temples and monuments were torn apart to fuel the pyre, and the smoke that rose carried with it not just a corpse, but the last illusion of stability. The conspirators, scattered and hunted, attempted to regroup, but their cause was already lost. They had misjudged Rome entirely, imagining it longed for liberty, when in truth it longed for order, spectacle, and the familiar hand of a strong ruler. The assassination of Caesar revealed the central irony of the Republic's final years. In killing him, the senators had proven him right. He had claimed that Rome was too unstable to function without concentrated power, and their actions demonstrated precisely that. The Senate had traded dictatorship for chaos, stability for civil war. By murdering Caesar, they had not saved the Republic. They had written its obituary. The vacuum left in his wake was not filled with law or liberty, but with rival claimants eager to seize the mantle he had dropped. And so the stage was set for another round of power struggles. Mark Antony positioned himself as Caesar's heir in spirit, if not in blood. Gaius Octavius, Caesar's teenage grandnephew and adopted son, appeared unexpectedly as a new contender, quiet at first but more dangerous than anyone suspected. Cleopatra of Egypt, entwined in the politics of the moment, brought her wealth and allure into the contest. The Republic, already staggering, was now a carcass pulled apart by scavengers. The knives had silenced Caesar, but they had not solved the problem of Rome. Instead, they had unleashed forces that would plunge the city into yet another cycle of civil war. The knives of the Ides of March had spilled Caesar's blood, but they had not restored the Republic. What they created instead was a void, and into that void poured ambition, vengeance, and opportunism. Mark Antony, Caesar's trusted lieutenant and self-styled successor, believed he could inherit his commander's mantle by sheer charisma and connection to the legions. The Senate, terrified of Antony, yet unwilling to let the Republic drift further into monarchy, attempted to balance him against a young and untested figure, Gaius Octavius, Caesar's adopted heir. Octavian, barely out of adolescence, seemed harmless enough to manipulate. The mistake of underestimating him would be one of the Senate's last. At first, the situation looked like another of Rome's endless factional disputes, with Antony commanding veteran soldiers and Octavian clinging to Caesar's name as his only asset. But Octavian had inherited more than a name. He had inherited Caesar's network, his client base, and the loyalty of men who had marched under Caesar's banners in Gaul. Octavian was careful, cautious, and patient, everything Antony was not. Antony bellowed speeches in the Forum and tried to dazzle the people with theatrics. Octavian quietly paid soldiers their promised bonuses, ensuring that their swords would point in his direction when the time came. In Rome, loyalty was not won with ideals but with cash, and Octavian understood the arithmetic of power better than anyone. Civil war became inevitable, and the first battles pitted Antony against the Senate itself, which foolishly allied with Octavian in an attempt to contain him. At Mutina, in 43 BCE, Antony suffered defeat, but the Senate's celebration was short-lived. Octavian realized he had no reason to prop up an institution that hated him, so he turned on his senatorial allies almost immediately. In the political chaos, a new arrangement emerged, the so-called Second Triumvirate, a legalized cartel of Antony, Octavian, and Marcus Lepidus, dividing the Roman world into spheres of influence. They claimed to be restoring order, but what they restored was terror. The Triumvir's first act was a purge that made Sulla's prescriptions look almost modest. Lists of enemies were posted in the Forum, and once again, Rome became a hunting ground for assassins and opportunists. Wealthy citizens found themselves declared traitors overnight, their property seized, their heads mounted on spikes. Cicero, the great orator who had tried to rally the Republic with his speeches, was hunted down and killed, his hands and tongue nailed to the rostra as a warning to anyone who thought words could matter more than swords. The Republic had once prided itself on debate, now it prided itself on executions. With their enemies eliminated, the triumvirs turned their attention outward, to the final reckoning with Caesar's assassins. At Philippi in 42 BCE, Brutus and Cassius led their forces against Antony and Octavian. The battle ended in disaster for the so-called liberators. Cassius, misled into thinking his troops were defeated, fell on his sword. Brutus fought on longer but eventually did the same. The dream of restoring the Republic died with them on the battlefield, leaving Antony and Octavian as masters of the Roman world. They claimed to be avenging Caesar, but what they were really avenging was their own power. Rome's citizens watched from afar, less participants than spectators, as their leaders carved up the Mediterranean like a banquet. With the liberators gone, the uneasy alliance between Antony and Octavian began to fray. Lepidus, the third member of the triumvirate, was quietly sidelined, leaving the two rivals glaring at each other across a fractured empire. Antony made his base in the east, where he became entangled with Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. The union was as political as it was romantic. Cleopatra offered wealth, fleets, and the prestige of ancient monarchy. Antony offered Roman power and the illusion that he could restore stability. Octavian, meanwhile, stayed in Rome, consolidating his grip on the Senate and the people. Where Antony indulged in luxury, Octavian cultivated an image of modesty. Where Antony basked in Eastern splendor, Octavian posed as the guardian of traditional Roman values. The contrast was deliberate, and the propaganda war began long before the actual battles. Octavian accused Antony of betraying Rome, of being seduced by Cleopatra into turning the Republic into a province of Egypt. Whether this was true or not mattered less than the image. Antony was painted as a man who abandoned his Roman wife for a foreign queen, who squandered Roman virtue in exchange for Egyptian decadence. Cleopatra became the convenient villain, the exotic temptress luring Rome's general into betrayal. The Senate, ever eager to side with whoever seemed likeliest to win, declared war, not on Antony, but on Cleopatra, a rhetorical trick that allowed Octavian to avoid the awkward appearance of civil war while still aiming squarely at his rival. The final confrontation came at Actium in 31 BCE, a naval battle off the coast of Greece. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet, larger but poorly coordinated, faced Octavian's smaller but more disciplined navy under the command of Agrippa, Octavian's brilliant admiral. The battle was a mixture of chaos and anticlimax. Cleopatra, fearing capture, fled the battle with her ships, and Antony, torn between loyalty to his fleet and loyalty to her, followed. Their abandonment shattered morale, and Octavian's forces overwhelmed what remained. The decisive clash that was meant to determine the fate of the Republic ended less in heroic struggle than in flight and collapse. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Egypt, where they would meet their famous end, while Octavian emerged as sole master of Rome. The Senate, by now thoroughly domesticated, hailed Octavian as saviour. He was granted unprecedented powers, yet he presented them as temporary, as though he were merely tidying up the Republic before returning it to normal. It was a lie so transparent it hardly deserved the name, but Romans were exhausted enough to believe it. After decades of civil wars, proscriptions and massacres, the people longed for stability more than liberty. Octavian, soon to rename himself Augustus, provided exactly that, or at least the illusion of it. He wrapped autocracy in republican forms, keeping the Senate as a decorative relic, preserving elections as hollow rituals, and pretending that Rome was still a republic, when in fact it had become a monarchy in all but name. This was the death of the republic, not a single event, not a dramatic collapse, but a slow suffocation beneath layers of deception. The senators who had once stabbed Caesar to save liberty now prostrated themselves before his heir. The assemblies that had once thundered with debate now applauded on cue. The people who had once rioted for grain now cheered at spectacles funded by imperial coffers. Liberty had not been restored. It had been embalmed, a corpse dressed in fine clothing, and displayed for the comfort of those who could not bear to admit the truth. Rome called it renewal, but it was burial. And yet in that burial, Rome found something it craved. Augustus offered peace, or at least the facade of it. The endless civil wars had ended, the frontiers were guarded, and the streets of Rome were filled less with corpses and more with festivals. Bread was distributed, games were staged, and temples were restored. To the weary citizens, it felt like a golden age. To the historian, it looks like the final victory of monarchy over liberty. The Republic had been murdered, mutilated, and paraded like Caesar's toga, but Augustus convinced everyone that it was alive and well. He gave the illusion of choice, the comfort of ritual, and the promise of stability. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was born less from harmony than exhaustion. Decades of civil wars had scarred the city. Bodies had hung on proscription lists. Streets had run with blood, and fortunes had been burned or confiscated overnight. Against that backdrop, Augustus's careful, almost bureaucratic despotism seemed refreshing. He filled the granaries, staged games, restored temples, and poured money into public works. Statues of him appeared everywhere, marble likenesses depicting him as youthful and serene, an eternal statesman who seemed to age more slowly than the rest of the world. Bread kept the poor fed, circuses kept them entertained, and monuments provided the illusion of permanence. Rome congratulated itself on a new golden age, even as it was slowly being smothered beneath Augustus' control. The bread was literal, the circuses spectacular. Grain shipments from Egypt became the lifeblood of the city, ensuring that the growing urban population could be pacified with free or subsidized food. The Colosseum did not yet exist, but Augustus made do with theatres, amphitheatres, and temporary wooden structures large enough to stage gladiatorial contests and mock naval battles. Romans flocked to see slaves and criminals butchered for sport, cheering as if liberty itself had been restored by the crack of a gladiator's sword. Augustus understood that nothing brought contentment quite like distraction, and he supplied it in endless quantity. The more marble he poured into temples and forums, the less anyone noticed how little remained of republican freedom. Augustus also expanded Rome's frontiers, though carefully. His generals pushed deeper into Spain, secured Gaul, and added Egypt as a permanent province after the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra. These conquests brought wealth, slaves, and prestige, yet they also brought a risk. In Germania, legions were wiped out in the Teutoburg forest in 9 CE. 3 whole armies annihilated in a single ambush. The news struck Rome like a thunderclap, shattering the illusion that Augustus's peace was unassailable. The emperor tore at his clothes and reportedly cried out, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." It was a reminder that Rome's peace depended not on benevolence, but on constant expansion, and expansion meant endless war. The Pax Romana was less peace than victory, maintained by legions stationed in every corner of the empire, spears pointed outward and occasionally inward. Domestically, Augustus reshaped Roman life with equal parts reform and hypocrisy. He passed laws promoting marriage, punishing adultery, and rewarding large families, presenting himself as the guardian of Roman morality. Yet his own household was a showcase of scandal, with his daughter Julia notorious for flouting every law her father promoted. Augustus tolerated no rivals, exiling or executing those who appeared too ambitious, while claiming to abhor violence. His public image was one of moderation and restraint, yet behind the marble facade lay a paranoia as deep as any tyrant's. His spies monitored conversations, his allies eliminated threats quietly, and his laws tightened around the people like an invisible net. The Republic's old freedom of speech withered, replaced by cautious whispers and elaborate flattery. Religion became another tool of control. Augustus presented himself as the restorer of traditional Roman piety, reviving old temples and priesthoods, while carefully weaving his own image into divine narratives. He was declared the son of a god, thanks to Caesar's posthumous deification, and his own cult spread across the provinces. Sacrifices and prayers were offered in his name, not only to Jupiter and Mars, but to Augustus himself. The emperor, in his genius, had managed to wrap political obedience in religious devotion. To be loyal to Rome was to be loyal to Augustus, and to be loyal to Augustus was to be loyal to the gods. It was a neat trick, and it worked. Yet for all his success, Augustus never managed to erase the fragility of his system. His carefully constructed peace depended entirely on his person. Senators accepted his dominance because he was cautious, pragmatic, and generous enough to share scraps of dignity with them. The people adored him because he fed them, entertained them, and wrapped his rule in monuments. The legions followed him because he paid them and parcelled out land. But what would happen when Augustus died? The question haunted his reign. He tried to secure succession, grooming various heirs, but fate intervened repeatedly. Promising young relatives died of illness or accident, leaving him with Tiberius, a dour and reluctant successor, as his only option. Augustus's dynasty was less carefully planned than haphazardly cobbled together, a reminder that even emperors could not command destiny. The irony of Augustus's rule was that he had buried the Republic without admitting it. Laws were passed, elections held, and senators gave speeches, yet all of it was hollow. Augustus had reduced the Republic to a puppet show, its strings pulled by a single man who never raised his voice or wore a crown. He called himself Princeps, the first citizen, pretending to be merely the most important among equals. Everyone knew better, but everyone preferred the pretense. After decades of chaos, it was easier to worship stability than to risk freedom. The marble monuments gleamed, the grain ships docked, the gladiators performed, and the illusion held. When Augustus finally died in 14 CA, at the age of 75, Rome confronted the truth it had long avoided. The emperor who had tamed civil war, refashioned government, and wrapped autocracy in the garments of tradition was gone. In his place stood a dynasty, heirs who lacked his subtlety but inherited his power. The Senate deified him, adding another god to their already overcrowded pantheon, and the people mourned as though eternity itself had cracked. Yet beneath the mourning lay anxiety. The facade of peace Augustus had built was sturdy but not invulnerable, and with him gone, cracks would soon appear. The Republic was long dead, buried beneath marble and ceremony, but the empire he left behind was only as strong as those who came after. For the next half-century, Rome was ruled not by statesmen, but by the Julio-Claudian dynasty, a family soap opera that would have been comic if it had not involved executions, purges, and entire provinces suffering for the whims of one household. What Augustus had built as a facade of stability quickly turned into a grim circus of sulking madness and paranoia. Tiberius, Augustus's stepson and reluctant heir, began his reign competently enough. He was experienced, militarily capable, and respected in his youth, but he never wanted the job. By temperament, he was dour, suspicious, and miserable, and over time his reign reflected that mood. Rome under Tiberius was not vibrant but stagnant, a city where trials for treason became routine and paranoia seeped into daily life. Senators were prosecuted for minor slights, and the emperor withdrew more and more from public life. Eventually, Tiberius retreated entirely to the island of Capri, leaving Rome in the hands of his prefect Sejanus, who ran the empire as though it were his personal assassination laboratory. For years, Sejanus eliminated rivals and tightened control until Tiberius finally realized he had created a monster and had him executed. By then, Rome had grown accustomed to fear, whispers, and sudden purges. When Tiberius finally died in 37 CE, few mourned him. Rumours spread that he had been smothered with a pillow to hurry along the process, and Rome collectively exhaled, relieved to be free of the emperor who had sulked his way through 2 decades. Relief turned quickly to shock when Gaius, better known as Caligula, took the throne. At first, the young emperor charmed Rome. He was the great-grandson of Augustus, the little boots mascot who had once toddled among soldiers, now elevated to emperor. He distributed money, staged games, and seemed a refreshing change after Tiberius' dour reign. But within months, his behaviour spiralled into cruelty and delusion. Ancient sources, admittedly prone to exaggeration, depict him as a man intoxicated by absolute power. He squandered fortunes on spectacles, declared himself a living god, and supposedly planned to make his horse a consul. He insulted senators, humiliated allies, and indulged in grotesque cruelty, treating executions as entertainment. Whether all the tales are true hardly matters. What mattered was the impression. Rome had gone from Augustus's careful manipulation to a madman flaunting power like a child with a sword. After 4 years, the Praetorian Guard had enough. In 41 CE, Caligula was stabbed to death in his palace, his bloodied body left as proof that even emperors could be discarded when their madness became intolerable. Into this chaos stepped Claudius, Caligula's uncle, who had been largely ignored by the family as a harmless fool. Claudius stammered, limped, and was dismissed as weak-minded, which may have saved his life during earlier purges. When the Praetorian Guard discovered him hiding behind a curtain after Caligula's assassination, they hauled him out and proclaimed him emperor. Rome suddenly found itself ruled by a man it had considered a joke. To everyone's surprise, Claudius proved competent, if eccentric. He expanded the empire by annexing Britain, built aqueducts and roads, and strengthened the bureaucracy by employing freedmen as administrators. But his reign was haunted by palace intrigue. His marriages were disasters, most notoriously his union with Agrippina the Younger, who manoeuvred her son Nero into position as heir. Claudius himself died in 54 CE, likely poisoned by Agrippina to speed along Nero's succession. Whether by accident or design, the bumbling survivor had managed to expand Rome's power even as his household corroded into dysfunction. Then came Nero, perhaps the most infamous of all Rome's emperors. At first, under the guidance of his mother Agrippina and advisors like Seneca, Nero's rule showed promise. But power corrupted quickly, and soon his reign dissolved into indulgence and paranoia. Nero fancied himself an artist, a poet, and a performer. He sang on stage, raced chariots, and forced senators to sit through his endless recitals, their applause less about appreciation than survival. His devotion to spectacle drained the treasury, while his paranoia filled the prisons. Agrippina, the mother who had placed him on the throne, was eventually murdered on his orders, her death one of many that stained his reign. The most enduring image of Nero comes from the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. The blaze consumed large swathes of the city, leaving thousands homeless. Rumours spread that Nero himself had ordered the fire to clear space for his extravagant golden house, a sprawling palace with halls gilded in gold and gardens large enough for lakes. Ancient writers claimed he fiddled while Rome burned, though fiddles did not exist and the tale may be embellishment. What mattered was the symbolism. While citizens died in flames, their emperor sang. Nero deflected blame by accusing Christians, a small sect already viewed with suspicion, and launched one of the earliest persecutions, crucifying them, burning them alive, and feeding them to animals in the arena. Public suffering was transformed into public spectacle, and once again, the city learned that in Rome, cruelty was policy. By the late 60s CE, Nero's excesses had drained both patience and loyalty. His extravagance bankrupted the treasury, his paranoia alienated the elite, and his neglect of the legions proved fatal. Revolts erupted across the provinces, led by ambitious generals who saw opportunity in Rome's weakness. The Senate, long reduced to ornament, finally turned against him. Declared a public enemy, Nero fled the city. In June of 68 CE, facing capture, he took his own life with the help of a secretary, muttering that he was losing an artist from the world. Rome was less concerned with the loss of art than with the fact that the emperor's suicide had left the empire headless. Nero's suicide in 68 CE was not the end of Rome's problems, but the beginning of a spectacular unravelling. The Julio-Claudian dynasty had collapsed in scandal and fire, and for the first time since Augustus, the empire had no clear heir. Rome had not built a system of succession. It had built a stage for one family's melodrama. With that family gone, the empire became a prize for anyone ambitious enough to seize it. What followed was a year in which emperors rose and fell in rapid succession, each proclaimed as saviour, each discarded as failure. The Year of the Four Emperors, as it would later be called, was Rome's clearest demonstration that the emperor was less a divine necessity than a disposable office, useful so long as he could keep the legions loyal and the mob entertained. The first to claim the throne was Servius Sulpicius Galba, governor of Hispania Tarraconensis. Galba had a reputation for sternness, which is a polite way of saying that people found him joyless and tight-fisted. He marched on Rome with the support of the legions and was greeted as a welcome alternative to Nero's debauchery. At first, the Senate hailed him as a restorer of discipline, a man who might bring dignity back to an office that had been dragged through Nero's golden house. But Galba made the fatal mistake of believing that principles mattered more than politics. He tried to enforce austerity, cancelled bribes, and punished soldiers who had expected rewards. The Praetorian Guard, accustomed to cash bonuses with each new emperor, discovered that Galba considered such payments corrupt. To them, it was not corruption, but tradition, and Galba's refusal marked him as both stingy and foolish. Within months, his support eroded. In January 69 CE, Galba was ambushed and murdered in the Forum by soldiers who had once sworn loyalty to him. His head was paraded through the streets, a grisly reminder that emperors who ignored the expectations of their soldiers did not last long. Rome had endured 14 years of Nero's antics, yet Galba managed to survive only 7 months. His reign proved less a restoration of virtue than a cautionary tale about the futility of integrity in an empire run on bribes and blood. Into the chaos stepped Marcus Salvius Otho, a man once friendly with Nero and better known for vanity than statesmanship. Otho had expected to succeed Galba peacefully, but when Galba adopted another heir, Otho conspired with the Praetorian Guard to seize power. The guards assassinated Galba and proclaimed Otho emperor, reminding the Senate and the people that the throne was now effectively decided by whoever held the barracks closest to the Palatine Hill. Otho's rule was brief but frantic. He tried to curry favour with both the Senate and the people, reversing Galba's stinginess with generous promises. But promises could not conjure legitimacy, and Otho soon faced a rival. In the provinces, the legions in Germany proclaimed their own candidate, Aulus Vitellius, a general whose main qualification was popularity with his troops and a reputation for indulgence. The Rhine legions marched on Italy, and Otho suddenly found himself in a civil war only months into his reign. The decisive clash came at the Battle of Bedriacum, where Otho's forces were defeated. Rather than prolong the bloodshed, Otho chose suicide, stabbing himself after writing letters to his family and friends. His death was framed by some as noble, a final act of dignity in a career otherwise defined by vanity. To Rome, it was another sign that emperors were interchangeable, their fates determined less by policy than by the mood of distant legions. Vitellius entered Rome in triumph, greeted with pomp and celebration, but his reign quickly descended into excess. A man of gluttony more than governance, Vitellius indulged himself with banquets and spectacles while the empire continued to fracture around him. Ancient writers describe him gorging on multiple meals a day, a caricature of indulgence. But his real flaw was not overeating. It was overpromising. He lavished money on his troops, straining the treasury, and purged his enemies with reckless abandon. Meanwhile, in the east, yet another challenger emerged, Titus Flavius Vespasianus, better known as Vespasian. Vespasian had been commanding Roman forces in Judea, tasked with crushing the Jewish revolt. A seasoned soldier, practical and unpretentious, he represented everything Vitellius was not. Supported by the legions of the East and Egypt, Vespasian declared himself emperor, and once again, Rome braced for another civil war. The conflict culminated in a second battle of Bedriacum, where Vespasian's forces crushed Vitellius's supporters. Rome itself became a battlefield. Vitellius was dragged from his palace, paraded through the streets, and executed, his body discarded in the Tiber. His reign had lasted less than a year, but it was long enough to remind Romans that the throne was little more than a gilded seat atop a meat grinder. By the end of 69 CE, the year of the four emperors had left Rome bloodied, exhausted, and more cynical than ever. The Senate had endorsed one emperor after another, proving its role was ceremonial at best. The Praetorian Guard had murdered, bribed, and switched allegiances with alarming ease. The provinces had revealed their true power, demonstrating that legions on distant frontiers could make or break emperors regardless of what happened in Rome. The city itself had been looted, burned, and terrorized by soldiers who claimed to be its protectors. The year had shown with brutal clarity that emperors were disposable, and that Rome's stability depended not on institutions or traditions, but on the of one man to keep enough soldiers happy for long enough. When Vespasian secured power at the end of the chaotic year of the four emperors, Rome had little appetite left for idealism. The Senate had humiliated itself by endorsing one claimant after another. The legions had revealed themselves as kingmakers, and the city had endured months of plunder and bloodshed. What the people craved was not liberty, nor even justice, but stability, and preferably entertainment. Vespasian understood this perfectly. He was not a man of noble birth or dazzling charisma, but a soldier, blunt and pragmatic, who recognized that ruling Rome required more than discipline. It required spectacle, and so he set about building the monument that would define his dynasty, a structure that would stand as Rome's most enduring symbol, the Flavian amphitheatre, later known as the Colosseum. The choice of location was as political as the construction itself. Nero's Golden House, that grotesque palace of indulgence with its artificial lake, had symbolized the corruption of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Vespasian drained the lake and used the land to begin the amphitheatre, transforming Nero's private luxury into a public arena. It was a gesture of populist theatre. Where Nero had hoarded pleasure for himself, Vespasian promised to return it to the people in the form of endless blood sport. The construction was funded in part by spoils from the Jewish war, the plunder of Jerusalem, and its temple funneled into stone and mortar. Thus, the suffering of one province became the entertainment of the capital, a pattern that would define Rome's empire for centuries. When the Colosseum was completed under Vespasian's sons, Titus and Domitian, it stood as a monument not to Roman virtue, but to Roman appetite. The arena could seat around 50,000 spectators, arranged carefully by class. Senators and equestrians occupied the best seats, while the poor were crammed higher up, and women and slaves were relegated to the very top rows. The architecture itself was a microcosm of Roman society, a hierarchy of privilege staring down at the slaughter below. The arena floor was covered in sand to soak up the blood, while beneath it stretched a labyrinth of tunnels, cages, and pulleys that allowed wild animals, gladiators, and machinery to appear suddenly in the middle of the spectacle. Rome had engineered not only a building, but a machine of death. The games themselves were a grotesque theatre. Gladiators, often slaves or criminals, fought each other with swords, tridents, or nets, their lives wagered on the whims of the crowd. Exotic animals, imported from across the empire, lions from Africa, tigers from the east, bears from the forests of Europe, were slaughtered for amusement, sometimes pitted against men, sometimes against each other. Condemned criminals were executed in staged reenactments of myths, torn apart by beasts while dressed as Icarus or Orpheus. It is claimed that naval battles were even staged by flooding the arena, turning the Colosseum into a temporary lake where miniature fleets clashed. The sheer logistics of the spectacle were as much a performance as the blood itself. For the Romans, watching death had become a civic ritual, a way to remind themselves that they were masters of the world and that life was expendable. The cruelty was not incidental, it was the point. The Colosseum was a machine that turned conquest into theatre, slaves into entertainment, and death into reassurance. Every beast dragged into the arena was a symbol of Rome's reach, every gladiator a reminder of its dominance. For the poor citizens in the stands, the games offered distraction from poverty and inequality. For the elites, they offered a chance to demonstrate generosity, sponsoring spectacles to buy favour with the crowd. For the emperors, they were a political safety valve, a way to keep the mob pacified and the restless city occupied. In a society built on conquest, spectacle became the glue that held everything together. The Flavian dynasty cemented this logic. Titus, who succeeded Vespasian, opened the Colosseum with 100 days of games, during which thousands of animals and fighters were slaughtered. It was a calculated gesture, a statement that his rule would be remembered not for policy but for generosity of blood. Titus also faced disasters, the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE and a devastating fire in Rome, but his popularity was secured through public relief and spectacle. He died young, mourned as a benevolent emperor, though his reign had been short and his achievements thin. His brother Domitian inherited the throne, extending the games while ruling with paranoia and cruelty. Domitian expanded the Colosseum and intensified the spectacle, but he also executed senators, exiled philosophers, and surrounded himself with spies. His reign ended in assassination in 96 CE, proof once again that emperors were less divine figures than fragile men balancing on the blade of public opinion. Yet the Colosseum endured. Through Titus's fleeting benevolence, Domitian's tyranny, and the endless churn of Roman politics, the arena stood as a constant. It outlasted emperors, fires, and even partial collapses, a permanent theatre of violence in a city addicted to spectacle. Citizens could lose faith in rulers, but they never lost faith in the games. To be Roman increasingly was to sit in the stands and cheer as blood stained the sand. The Colosseum became the Republic's replacement for the Forum, the true centre of public life. Legislation could be ignored, debates forgotten, but the games were sacred. They defined community, hierarchy, and identity more effectively than any law or philosophy. What the Flavians had done was to institutionalize distraction as state policy. Bread and circuses became more than a cynical observation. They became the operating principle of empire. Grain distributions kept the poor alive, games kept them docile, and marble monuments reminded everyone that Rome was eternal. The emperors did not need to inspire love, only gratitude for food and amusement. In a city where liberty had been traded for stability, spectacle was the only currency that mattered. The mob could not be given power, but it could be given panem et circenses, and that was enough to keep the streets quiet. The irony is that the Colosseum, celebrated as a wonder of architecture, was in truth a monument to Rome's fragility. It revealed how little faith emperors had in their people, and how much fear they had of unrest. By pouring resources into blood sport, the Flavians admitted that the empire's stability rested not on justice or prosperity, but on distraction. Rome had built an empire of stone and steel, yet its rulers knew it could collapse if the mob went hungry or bored. The Colosseum was not just entertainment, it was insurance. By the end of the Flavian dynasty, Rome had grown accustomed to this arrangement. The empire stretched across 3 continents, its armies stationed in distant provinces, its citizens increasingly detached from politics. What bound them together was not republican virtue or even imperial administration, but the shared experience of watching men and beasts die in an arena. The emperors had discovered the formula, and it would be passed down like a family heirloom. Bread to feed the belly, circuses to feed the eye, and monuments to convince the world that eternity was marble and blood. After the chaos of the Flavian dynasty, Rome entered what later historians would call a golden age, a period supposedly defined by wise rulers and relative stability. The label itself, the good emperors, comes from writers who lived long after the fact, nostalgic for a time when the empire seemed more orderly than their own. The reality was less serene. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius did indeed avoid some of the grotesque melodrama of Caligula or Nero, but their reigns were not free from brutality, exhaustion, or catastrophe. Rome under the good emperors expanded to its greatest extent, built magnificent works of architecture, and enjoyed decades without civil war, but at staggering human cost. If these were Rome's best rulers, one shudders to imagine what the bad ones were supposed to look like. The sequence began almost accidentally with Nerva in 96 CE. Domitian had been assassinated after years of tyranny, and the Senate, desperate to reassert some control, elevated Nerva, an elderly senator with no children and no army of his own. He was chosen precisely because he was harmless. His brief reign was more about survival than innovation. The Praetorian Guard, furious over Domitian's murder, forced him to adopt a military commander as heir. That man was Trajan, and with him, the empire gained both stability and momentum. Nerva died peacefully, a rarity among emperors, and his careful choice of successor set the precedent that adoption based on merit, or at least military loyalty, could replace biological succession. For a fleeting moment, Rome seemed to have discovered a system that worked. Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117 CE, became Rome's conqueror emperor, remembered as the man who expanded the empire to its greatest territorial reach. His campaigns against Dacia, in what is now Romania, were celebrated in endless propaganda. Trajan's column, still standing in Rome, spirals upward with carved scenes of battles, sieges, and triumphs. To the viewer, it looks like a continuous march of victory, a stone tapestry of Roman destiny. To the Dacians, it was annihilation, their land stripped of gold and their people enslaved. The wealth of Dacia poured into Rome, funding massive public works, forums, markets, and monuments that dazzled citizens. Trajan was hailed as Optimus Princeps, the best ruler, proof that conquest and generosity could coexist when fueled by plunder. Yet his campaigns also stretched Rome's resources thin, dragging soldiers ever further from home. Expansion was celebrated as glory, but the empire was already groaning under the weight of its own size. Hadrian, Trajan's adopted heir, shifted gears. Where Trajan had been the conqueror, Hadrian was the consolidator. He abandoned some of Trajan's conquests in the east, recognizing that the empire could not sustain endless expansion. Instead, he focused on fortifications, the most famous being Hadrian's Wall in Britain. Stretching across the northern frontier, it was less a wall of absolute defence than a monument to Rome's limits, an admission that beyond lay lands too wild to be worth conquering. Hadrian travelled extensively across the empire, inspecting provinces, building temples, and leaving behind monuments. His reign projected order and sophistication, but it was not free from cruelty. Jewish revolts in Judea were crushed with staggering brutality, entire cities destroyed, and survivors enslaved or dispersed. Hadrian renamed Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina and built a temple to Jupiter on the ruins of the Jewish temple, an act of desecration that ensured his memory would be one of infamy in the region. His reign demonstrated that Rome's so-called peace always depended on selective violence. Antoninus Pius, who ruled from 138 to 161 CE, presided over what many remember as a quiet reign. He was devout, restrained, and preferred diplomacy to war. Rome under Antoninus enjoyed relative stability, with few major campaigns or crises. Public works continued, law was codified, and administration hummed along. Yet stability was not prosperity for all. The empire still relied on slavery, provinces still groaned under taxation, and the city of Rome still demanded endless grain and games to remain docile. Antoninus may have been pious and gentle by imperial standards, but his reign did not remove the burdens carried by ordinary people. His greatness, such as it was, lay in the fact that he did not destabilize the system. In Rome, that counted as virtue. The last of the so-called good emperors was Marcus Aurelius, remembered as the philosopher king. A devotee of Stoicism, Marcus left behind the Meditations, a personal journal of reflections on duty, fate, and endurance. To later readers, he seemed almost saintly, a ruler who combined power with humility. Yet his reign was anything but peaceful. Wars erupted on the northern frontiers as Germanic tribes pushed against the empire, requiring Marcus to spend much of his time on campaign. His armies faced grueling winters, supply shortages, and constant skirmishes. The romantic image of the philosopher emperor is thus tempered by the reality of a weary man writing about endurance while surrounded by the mud and misery of endless war. Compounding the military strain was the Antonine Plague, which struck during Marcus's reign. Likely a form of smallpox, the epidemic swept through the empire, killing millions and devastating both the army and civilian populations. Cities shrank, fields went untended, and the sense of Rome's invulnerability cracked. Marcus, who had inherited an empire at its peak, presided over one that was suddenly stricken with exhaustion. His philosophy counselled acceptance of fate, but philosophy was cold comfort for a population watching friends and family collapse in fever. The plague underscored the fragility of the so-called Pax Romana, revealing that even Rome's grandeur could be undone by invisible forces. Yet for all the hardship, Marcus Aurelius remained respected. He was diligent, conscientious, and seen as genuinely devoted to his duties. He tried to rule with fairness, resisted indulgence, and worked tirelessly despite illness and grief. In another time, he might have left behind the memory of a truly great emperor, but his one unforgivable act was his choice of successor. Unlike his predecessors, who had adopted competent heirs, Marcus handed power to his biological son, Commodus. Whether out of paternal devotion or misplaced hope, the decision undid the fragile system of merit that had allowed the good emperors to function. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180 CE, he left the empire to his son Commodus, a decision that revealed just how fragile the so-called system of good emperors truly was. Instead of adopting competent heirs, Marcus had reverted to dynastic inheritance, and the result was catastrophic. Commodus styled himself a gladiator emperor, more interested in fighting in the arena and renaming Rome after himself than in governing. His assassination in 192 ACE plunged the empire into yet another civil war, proving once again that the imperial throne was a prize won by violence, not by principle. Out of the chaos eventually emerged the Severan dynasty, a family whose reign combined military expansion, fiscal ruin, and dynastic intrigue. If the good emperors had represented Rome's high water mark, the Severans revealed how quickly stability could turn into exhaustion. The dynasty began with Septimius Severus, a provincial from North Africa, who seized power in 193 CE after defeating rivals in a year of bloody conflict. Severus was an able soldier and administrator, but his reign marked a decisive shift in imperial policy. He elevated the army above all else, raising soldiers' pay, granting them privileges, and ensuring their loyalty through constant rewards. His advice to his sons on his deathbed was blunt: be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all others. It was a motto that captured the essence of Severan rule. The empire became less a community of citizens than a military machine, fueled by taxes, with emperors functioning as generals-in-chief, whose survival depended on keeping the legions happy. The consequences were predictable: soaring military costs, heavy taxation, and a widening gulf between the rulers and the ruled. Severus himself fought campaigns in Britain, pushing the frontier and constructing fortifications, though at great expense and with little long-term benefit. His military focus drained the treasury, but it also established the precedent that emperors could not afford to ignore the provinces where legions held sway. By emphasizing loyalty to the army above all else, Severus unintentionally undermined civilian administration and placed the empire's fate in the hands of soldiers who increasingly saw themselves as kingmakers. When Severus died in 211 CE, he left the throne to his two sons, Caracalla and Geta, a decision as disastrous as Marcus Aurelius' bequest to Commodus. Caracalla and Geta despised one another, and their rivalry poisoned the empire. Their mother, Julia Domna, attempted to mediate, but the hatred between the brothers was irreconcilable. Within months of their joint reign, Caracalla arranged the murder of Geta during what was supposed to be a reconciliation meeting. The younger brother was cut down in his mother's arms, his blood staining her clothing. Caracalla then ordered a purge of Geta's supporters, slaughtering thousands and erasing his brother's name from inscriptions. It was fratricide elevated to state policy, a grotesque reminder that Rome's founding myth of Romulus murdering Remus was not allegory but precedent. The empire's unity, already strained, was shattered further by the spectacle of an emperor who murdered family as casually as he taxed his subjects. Caracalla's most famous act as emperor was the Constitutio Antoniniana in 212 CE, which extended Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire. On paper, it sounded like generosity, a unifying gesture meant to erase the distinction between conquerors and conquered. In reality, it was a fiscal maneuver. More citizens meant more taxpayers, and Caracalla needed money. His lavish spending on the army and his massive construction projects, most famously the baths of Caracalla in Rome, drained the treasury. The baths themselves were marvels of engineering, vast complexes of marble halls, heated pools, and soaring vaults, capable of holding thousands of bathers at once. They projected the grandeur of Rome and the emperor's supposed benevolence, but they were also monuments to extravagance built on the backs of overtaxed provinces. To step into the steamy halls was to experience luxury, but also to smell the faint whiff of imperial desperation. Caracalla's obsession with the army was even more costly. He lavished pay raises and bonuses on soldiers to ensure their loyalty, but this only set a precedent that future emperors would be forced to match. Military expenditure consumed an ever larger share of the budget, leaving little for infrastructure or relief. Provinces groaned under the burden of taxation, while the emperor spent much of his time campaigning to maintain prestige. In 217 CE, while travelling in the east, Caracalla was assassinated by a disgruntled soldier, stabbed while relieving himself on the roadside. It was an ignominious end for a man who had styled himself as a warrior emperor, and it underscored the danger of relying on soldiers' loyalty. What the army granted, the army could also take away. After Caracalla's death, the Severan dynasty lurched through further instability. Successors such as Elagabalus and Severus Alexander revealed the fragility of dynastic succession. Elagabalus, a teenager elevated to the throne, scandalized Rome with his devotion to an Eastern sun god, his eccentric rituals, and his disregard for Roman tradition. He was accused of sexual improprieties, bizarre religious practices, and general incompetence. Whether all the stories are true or later exaggerations, his reign quickly became synonymous with chaos. He was murdered by the Praetorian Guard in 222 CE. His body dragged through the streets and dumped into the Tiber, another reminder that emperors were disposable when they ceased to amuse or reward their protectors. Severus Alexander, who followed, attempted to restore some measure of dignity, guided heavily by his mother, Julia Mamaea. But his reign was defined by weakness. He struggled to assert authority over the legions, who grew increasingly impatient with civilian interference. Campaigns against Germanic tribes and the new Persian Empire ended in indecisive outcomes, further undermining his credibility. After Severus Alexander and his mother were murdered by mutinous soldiers in 235 CE, the empire entered what later historians would label the crisis of the 3rd century. Crisis is almost too mild a word. For half a century, Rome staggered through an unending carousel of emperors, invasions, plagues, and economic breakdowns, each disaster compounding the others until the empire very nearly collapsed. The Republic had once prided itself on endurance, the empire on stability, but by the mid-3rd century, those illusions were shattered. What remained was chaos stretched across the Mediterranean world, a 50-year reminder that even the so-called eternal city could come perilously close to expiration. The central problem was simple: succession. The army had learned that it could make emperors and unmake them at will. Commanders were proclaimed by their troops in distant provinces, marched on Rome, or fought their rivals, and were usually murdered before they could establish any real authority. In some decades, emperors lasted only months, their reigns measured in the time it took their legions to grow dissatisfied. Coins were struck with their faces, decrees issued in their names, and then both were forgotten when the next general claimed power. The imperial purple became less a sign of divinity than a death sentence. Historians count over 20 emperors in a span of 50 years, and that tally does not include the countless usurpers who rose and fell without leaving enough trace to be remembered. Rome had become a machine that devoured its rulers as efficiently as it devoured its enemies. External threats pressed from every direction, exposing the weakness created by internal division. Germanic tribes raided across the Rhine and Danube, sometimes overwhelming frontier defences and plundering deep into Roman territory. In the east, a new power emerged, the Sassanid Persian Empire, more aggressive and organised than its Parthian predecessors. Rome suffered humiliating defeats at their hands. In 260 CE, Emperor Valerian marched east to confront the Persians, only to be captured alive by King Shapur I. He spent the rest of his life in captivity, used as a human footstool by his conqueror, according to Roman sources, until he finally died in disgrace. His skin, it was said, was stuffed and displayed as a trophy. Whether exaggerated or not, the story symbolised the collapse of Roman prestige. An emperor, once imagined as the embodiment of Jupiter on earth, had been reduced to a prop in another king's parlour. Meanwhile, provinces began to peel away. In Gaul, local commanders established what became known as the Gallic Empire, a breakaway state that functioned independently for over a decade. In the east, Palmyra, under Queen Zenobia, carved out its own empire, ruling Syria, Egypt, and parts of Asia Minor with remarkable efficiency. These separatist regimes did not immediately declare war on Rome, but simply operated as if the central government no longer mattered, and in truth for much of the 3rd century, it didn't. Rome itself remained the symbolic capital, but authority radiated weakly from its senatorial palaces. The real power lay with whichever general could keep an army fed and loyal for more than a season. Economic collapse deepened the crisis. The empire's constant wars required constant funding, and with provinces breaking away and trade routes disrupted, revenue shrank. Emperors resorted to debasing the currency, reducing the silver content of coins until they were little more than bronze discs with a thin wash of precious metal. Inflation soared, markets destabilized, and ordinary citizens watched the value of their money disintegrate. Soldiers paid an increasingly worthless coin, demanded more, fueling an endless cycle of expenditure and devaluation. Taxation rose, squeezing farmers and landowners alike, while trade dwindled under the strain of insecurity. Rome, once the economic engine of the Mediterranean, now limped under a currency that was mocked more than it was trusted. On top of war and financial chaos came plague. Epidemics swept across the empire in waves, striking soldiers in the field and citizens in crowded cities. The so-called Plague of Cyprian in the mid-3rd century killed thousands daily at its height, spreading terror and depopulating entire regions. Accounts describe symptoms of fever, vomiting, blindness, and ulcers, leaving bodies piled in streets and fields untended. Cities shrank, armies dwindled, and the labour force contracted. For a society already dependent on manpower for farming, construction, and war, the losses were crippling. To many Romans, it seemed as though the gods had finally abandoned them. Sacrifices increased, new cults flourished, and the desperation of a population searching for meaning in catastrophe only grew. The psychological toll of these decades cannot be overstated. For generations, Romans had been taught that their empire was eternal, their legions unbeatable, and their gods reliable. The 3rd century stripped those illusions bare. Emperors were mocked as transients, borders were breached, money was worthless, and pestilence stalked the land. Temples could be rebuilt, monuments restored, but the confidence that had once defined Rome was gone. The empire did not feel eternal. It felt brittle, fragile, and doomed. Even victories, when they came, were temporary, undone by the next usurpation or invasion. Citizens no longer asked whether Rome would endure, but whether it would survive the year. And yet, for all the chaos, the empire did not vanish. This resilience, paradoxical and maddening, was Rome's most consistent trait. Local communities continued to function, cities continued to administer themselves, and armies, even when rebelling, still defended their frontiers against outsiders. The sheer size and inertia of the empire kept it alive, even as its leadership disintegrated. Provinces might peel away, but they were eventually reconquered. Usurpers might seize power, but their reigns ended, and someone else took the purple. Rome staggered but did not fall. The crisis of the 3rd century revealed not just Rome's fragility, but its uncanny ability to endure disasters that would have annihilated smaller states. By the 270s, a measure of stability returned under emperors like Aurelian, who reconquered the Gallic Empire and Palmyra, briefly stitching the empire back together. He earned the title Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world, though his reign lasted only 5 years before assassination claimed him as well. Even restoration, it seemed, was temporary. The cycle of short-lived emperors, fiscal strain, and endless threats continued, leaving Rome perpetually exhausted. What was once an empire of conquest had become an empire of maintenance, its energy spent simply on surviving another decade. By the end of the 3rd century, it was clear that the old model could not endure. The system of emperors rising through military acclaim, ruling briefly, and dying violently was unsustainable. The constant drain of civil wars and invasions had exposed the flaws in an empire that relied too heavily on personality and army loyalty. The currency was debased, the provinces restive, the frontiers insecure, and the people demoralized. Rome had not collapsed, but it had been hollowed, like a building whose facade still stands, while the interior has rotted away. Only drastic reform could prevent the entire structure from crumbling into ruin, and so, out of the rubble of 50 years of chaos, emerged a new figure. When Diocletian rose to power in 284 CE, proclaimed emperor by his soldiers after yet another mutiny had eliminated his predecessor, the empire was already a husk of its former self. 50 years of anarchy had left Rome barely recognizable. Borders had collapsed, coinage had been debased to the point of parody, and the throne itself had become little more than a revolving door for doomed generals. If Rome was eternal, it was eternal only in the sense of an illness that refused to kill its host. Diocletian, a man of humble origins from the Balkans, understood that he was not inheriting an empire to enjoy, but a patient on life support. His reign would be less about grandeur and more about triage, less about glory than survival. His first realization was brutal but accurate. No one man could govern the empire anymore. The days of Augustus, pretending to restore the Republic while ruling alone, were long gone. The empire stretched from Britain to Syria, from the Rhine to the Sahara, and no single administrator could keep all its frontiers secure. Diocletian's solution was to divide the empire formally, creating what became known as the Tetrarchy, or rule of four. He appointed a co-emperor, Maximian, to govern the western provinces while he took the east. Beneath them, two junior emperors, known as Caesars, were assigned to assist and eventually succeed. On parchment, it was a masterpiece of organisation, a rational system that promised smooth transitions, shared burdens, and stability. In practice, it created 4 courts, 4 armies, and 4 centres of intrigue, multiplying rather than eliminating the problem of succession. Still, it was clever enough to buy the empire a reprieve. Diocletian's style of rule left little room for pretense. Where Augustus had cloaked himself as the first citizen, Diocletian embraced naked autocracy. He surrounded himself with elaborate rituals, demanding prostration from subjects, and dressing in jewelled robes, more suited to Eastern monarchs than Roman generals. He was no longer content to be princeps, the modest first among equals. He was dominus, master, the embodiment of authority. Senators already reduced to decoration were now humiliated into irrelevance. The empire was no longer pretending to be a republic. It was a monarchy in everything but name, and under Diocletian, even the name had ceased to matter. Reform came in waves, harsh and often desperate. The army, always the empire's most dangerous and necessary institution, was expanded and reorganised. Frontier defences were strengthened, mobile units created, and garrisons stationed more widely. The aim was to ensure that invasions could be repelled without waiting for emperors to march halfway across the empire. The tax system was overhauled, tied more rigidly to land and labour, squeezing peasants and landowners alike to feed the insatiable demands of the army and bureaucracy. In 301 CE, Diocletian even issued the edict on maximum prices, a desperate attempt to halt inflation by fixing wages and costs across the empire. The edict was impossible to enforce and widely ignored, but it revealed the depth of the crisis. Rome's economy, once the marvel of the Mediterranean, had become so unstable that the emperor tried to legislate the price of cabbages. For ordinary Romans, these reforms meant little improvement. Taxes grew heavier, conscription more frequent, and bureaucrats more intrusive. Farmers were bound to their land, a system that foreshadowed medieval serfdom, while professions became hereditary, trapping families in occupations generation after generation. The empire was kept alive, but it was an empire of exhaustion, where survival replaced prosperity. Diocletian may have succeeded in preventing immediate collapse, but he did so by grinding his subjects into submission. The illusion of Roman freedom, long gone, was now replaced by the blunt reality of imperial control. Religion became another battlefield. Diocletian, devoted to Rome's traditional gods, viewed the rise of Christianity as a threat to unity. Christians refused to sacrifice to the old deities, undermining the rituals that bound Rome together in the emperor's eyes. In 303 CE, he launched the Great Persecution, ordering churches destroyed, scriptures burned, and Christians stripped of legal protections. Thousands were imprisoned, tortured, or executed, their blood meant to appease the old gods and restore favour. The persecution, however, revealed the limits of even Diocletian's authority. Far from eradicating Christianity, it often strengthened it, creating martyrs whose stories spread across the empire. The attempt to unify Rome through religious conformity instead highlighted its fractures, and within a generation, the faith Diocletian despised would become the empire's official religion. Despite his iron control, Diocletian was not immune to the exhaustion of rule. After 2 decades of managing the empire's endless crises, he did something almost unimaginable. He retired. In 305 CE, he abdicated voluntarily, retreating to a palace on the Dalmatian coast, where he devoted himself to gardening and reflection. When urged years later to return to power, he supposedly replied that he could not be bothered, preferring his cabbages to politics. It was a rare moment of humility in an age of ambition, and a grim joke at the expense of an empire that had nearly devoured him. His abdication, however, revealed the flaw in his carefully designed tetrarchy. Without his personal authority to hold it together, the system fractured almost immediately. The junior emperors and their successors began to quarrel, alliances dissolved, and rival claimants emerged. The very division meant to stabilize Rome became the source of new instability. Soldiers once again proclaimed their generals as emperors, and civil wars erupted across the empire. Diocletian had bought time, but he had not solved the underlying problem. Rome could not reconcile its size, its armies, and its ambitions with stable succession. And yet, for all the failure, Diocletian had succeeded in one crucial sense. The empire did not collapse. His reforms, harsh though they were, had given Rome the scaffolding it needed to endure another century. He had admitted that the empire was too large for one man and too fragile for pretense, and by sheer will he had kept it alive. The price was authoritarianism, taxation, and fear, but Rome had always been willing to pay such prices when survival was at stake. By the early 4th century, the empire had once again dissolved into squabbling generals and collapsing arrangements. Diocletian's careful tetrarchy, meant to prevent civil wars, had fractured into precisely that. Multiple emperors claimed legitimacy. Armies clashed with one another as eagerly as they did with barbarians, and the empire once more staggered toward dissolution. Out of this chaos emerged Constantine, a man who understood that Rome's future would not be secured by restoring the past, but by reinventing it. He was not content to be just another general with a purple cloak. He would transform the empire's identity, shifting its spiritual core and even moving its capital. By the time he was finished, Rome was no longer Rome, at least not in the way it had once been imagined. Constantine's rise was drenched in the same violence that had accompanied so many before him. After Diocletian's abdication, the empire splintered into a carousel of emperors and usurpers. Constantine, son of Constantius Chlorus, one of the original Caesars of the Tetrarchy, was declared emperor by his father's troops in Britain in 306 CE. His claim was contested immediately, and years of warfare followed as he battled rivals across the empire. The decisive moment came in 312 CE, when Constantine faced Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge, just outside Rome. According to legend, on the eve of battle, Constantine looked to the sky and saw a vision, a cross of light, accompanied by the words, "In hoc signo vinces," "In this sign you will conquer." Taking the vision as divine endorsement, he ordered his soldiers to paint the Christian symbol on their shields. The following day his army triumphed, Maxentius drowned in the Tiber, and Constantine entered Rome as its undisputed ruler. Whether the vision was miracle, propaganda, or simply convenient memory, it marked a turning point in Roman history. For 3 centuries, Christianity had been a persecuted sect, alternately ignored and hunted, its followers executed as criminals for refusing to sacrifice to the traditional gods. Now the emperor himself claimed divine favour from the Christian god. In 313 CE, Constantine and his co-emperor Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, which legalised Christianity and granted tolerance to all religions within the empire. For Christians who had endured torture, imprisonment, and martyrdom under Diocletian's great persecution, the reversal was extraordinary. From outlawed cult to imperial partner, the Church suddenly found itself at the heart of Roman power. The shift was not immediate or absolute. Paganism remained widespread. Temples still operated, and old rituals continued. Constantine himself remained a complex figure, still honouring Sul Invictus, the unconquered sun, while favouring Christianity more and more openly. But the trajectory was unmistakable. Constantine showered the Church with privileges, exempting clergy from taxes, donating land, and commissioning basilicas. Bishops, once obscure leaders of persecuted congregations, became imperial advisors. Christianity, which had thrived in the shadows, now flourished in the light of state sponsorship. With favour came conflict. As Christianity moved from survival to dominance, theological disputes became political crises. Constantine, eager to maintain unity, intervened directly. In 325 CE, he convened the Council of Nicaea, gathering bishops from across the empire to settle disputes over doctrine. The immediate issue was the teaching of Arius, who argued that Christ was subordinate to the Father, a position that divided congregations bitterly. The council, under Constantine's watchful eye, condemned Arianism and produced the Nicene Creed, a statement of faith meant to unify belief. The irony was stark. An emperor who only recently converted, still unbaptized, was now refereeing the theology of a religion he barely understood. Yet his involvement underscored the new reality. Christianity was no longer a sect. It was an imperial religion, inseparable from statecraft. Constantine's most dramatic transformation, however, was geographical. Rome, the eternal city, had long since ceased to be a practical capital. Its location was inconvenient, far from the frontiers where emperors actually fought, and its senatorial aristocracy was a constant thorn in imperial control. Constantine turned instead to the east, founding a new capital at Byzantium on the Bosporus, which he refashioned as Constantinople. Strategically placed between Europe and Asia, rich in trade and easily defensible, the city symbolized the shift in Rome's center of gravity. The empire's heart was no longer the old Forum or the Palatine Hill, but the gleaming new metropolis in the east. Rome itself remained a ceremonial relic, proud but hollow, while Constantinople became the true seat of power. The symbolism of this move cannot be overstated. Augustus had pretended to restore the Republic while quietly ruling as monarch. Diocletian had dropped the pretense entirely, ruling as dominus, master. Constantine went further still, remaking the empire's religion and relocating its capital. He was not preserving Rome, but transforming it into something unrecognizable. To pagans, the shift was jarring. To Christians, it was miraculous. Either way, the message was clear. Rome's eternity lay not in its traditions, but in its ability to reinvent itself. For ordinary people, Constantine's reforms brought both hope and burden. Christians gained legitimacy and privilege, but others saw their traditions marginalized. Pagan temples lost funds, while Christian churches rose with imperial backing. Taxes remained heavy, wars continued, and provinces still groaned under the demands of empire. The machinery of survival built by Diocletian remained intact. Rigid taxation, binding professions, and a bloated bureaucracy. Constantine did not lighten the load. He merely repainted it in Christian colours. The empire was still a grinding machine, but now its ideology had shifted. Survival was no longer about appeasing Jupiter and Mars, but about carrying the cross of Christ into battle. By the time of Constantine's death in 337 CIE, the transformation was complete. Christianity had gone from persecuted sect to imperial partner. Bishops wielded political influence. Councils shaped doctrine under imperial gaze, and churches dominated cityscapes. The emperor himself, baptized only on his deathbed, was remembered as Constantine the Great, the man who had refashioned Rome. Yet his legacy was not unambiguously glorious. By entwining church and state, he ensured that theological disputes would henceforth carry the weight of civil wars. By founding Constantinople, he signalled that the West, the old heart of Rome, was now secondary. And by ruling as a Christian monarch, he set the empire on a path that would alienate as many as it inspired. The long-term effect was division. The East, anchored by Constantinople, grew stronger, wealthier, and more secure. The West, weighed down by decaying institutions, shrinking resources, and mounting pressures, began to rot. Constantine had remade Rome, but in doing so, he had also split its identity. The empire was still one on paper, but in reality, its future lay east of the Adriatic. The eternal city remained, but it was no longer eternal in significance. The east was ascendant, while the west drifted toward ruin. Constantinople had trade, wealth, and defensible walls. The west had hollow emperors, bankrupt coffers, and borders fraying under constant pressure. On maps, the empire still stretched grandly across Europe and the Mediterranean. In reality, it was a rotting husk propped up by memory and inertia. The eternal city remained a symbol, but symbols cannot pay soldiers, repair aqueducts, or feed the starving. The emperors of the West became shadows of their predecessors, more placeholders than rulers. Few reigned long enough to leave a mark, and those who did are remembered mostly for failure. The throne was passed like a poisoned chalice, seized by generals, usurpers, or court officials who pulled the strings behind children draped in imperial robes. Each new emperor promised revival. Each was betrayed by conspiracies, assassinations, or the blunt fact that there was nothing left to revive. Civil wars erupted with weary regularity, draining resources that might have defended the frontiers. The emperors may have worn laurel crowns, but they were less masters of the world than caretakers of decline. Beyond the crumbling palaces, pressure mounted from every direction. Germanic tribes pressed across the Rhine and Danube, probing Rome's defences. The Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, and countless smaller groups pushed against the empire's borders, driven by hunger, climate change, and pressure from other migrating peoples. Rome still called them barbarians, but they were organised enough to overwhelm tired legions and carve out space within Roman territory. The empire had once absorbed outsiders through conquest and assimilation. By the 4th century, it was being infiltrated by a necessity. Entire tribes settled as allies, or federati, in exchange for promises of military service. Rome had gone from conqueror to negotiator, bribing enemies to guard borders it could no longer defend. The cracks widened disastrously in 376 CE, when the Visigoths, fleeing the advance of the Huns, begged permission to cross the Danube and settle within the empire. The Roman authorities agreed, but corruption and mismanagement turned resettlement into disaster. Officials extorted the starving refugees, selling them dog meat at outrageous prices until desperation boiled into revolt. 2 years later, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Visigoths annihilated a Roman army and killed the Eastern Emperor Valens. It was a shock on the scale of Cannae centuries earlier, but this time there was no Roman recovery. The aura of invincibility was gone. From then on, the empire was negotiating not from strength but from weakness, buying peace with concessions, land and gold. Meanwhile, the West suffered its own slow starvation. Agriculture faltered as estates fell into neglect, harvests shrank, and famines recurred. Climate fluctuations made the problem worse, as did constant raiding. Cities, once thriving centres of trade and culture, contracted into fortified shells of their former selves. Aqueducts cracked, forums emptied, and amphitheatres crumbled. The grandeur remained in stone, but the life that had animated it was gone. The economy, never stable since the 3rd century crisis, staggered under debased coinage, oppressive taxation, and shrinking productivity. Wealth flowed east to Constantinople, leaving the West perpetually impoverished. Ordinary Romans bore the weight of this collapse, paying in hunger and insecurity, while emperors pretended that ceremony could mask decay. Corruption gnawed at what remained. Governors extorted their provinces, generals sold military commissions, and officials siphoned off what little revenue could be collected. Soldiers, once proud of discipline, deserted for lack of pay or turned on the empire itself, selling loyalty to the highest bidder. Even the church, now a powerful institution within the empire, became entangled in intrigue, bishops and emperors feuding over theology while the frontiers burned. Unity of faith could not substitute for unity of administration. Rome had adopted Christianity as its moral glue, but even divine sanction could not hold together a system collapsing from neglect and exhaustion. The sack of Rome itself in 410 CE by Alaric and the Visigoths was both symbolic and devastating. The Eternal City, untouched by foreign armies for nearly 8 centuries, was plundered over 3 days. Temples and palaces were looted, aristocrats ransomed, and citizens terrorized. Pagans blamed Christianity for abandoning the old gods. Christians claimed it proved the transience of earthly kingdoms. For ordinary Romans it meant hunger, homelessness, and humiliation. Rome did not fall in a single night, but the sack revealed how little was left of its grandeur. The empire survived the blow, but only in the sense that a corpse survives when propped up by ropes. In the decades that followed, the West limped from one disaster to the next. Vandals crossed into North Africa, seizing the grain supply that had once fed Rome. Huns swept into Europe, extorting gold from terrified emperors who dared not face them in open battle. Provinces broke away or were abandoned, their cities left to fend for themselves. The army, increasingly composed of barbarian recruits, fought less for Rome than for whichever general offered the best prospects. The line between Roman and barbarian blurred until the empire was less a civilization defending itself than a patchwork of collapsing alliances. The end of the Western Roman Empire did not arrive in a blaze of glory. There was no final stand on the walls, no last emperor dying heroically with a sword in his hand. It arrived in 476 CE with a shrug, a signature, and a tired bureaucracy that had been hollowed out long before. The empire that had once thundered across continents, crushed Carthage, and paraded captive kings through the Forum ended not in fire but in paperwork. Its last emperor was not a titan of ambition or a demonic tyrant, but a boy, Romulus Augustulus, a name chosen with cruel irony. Romulus like the mythical founder who killed his brother to build a city, and Augustus like the first emperor who wrapped monarchy in marble and ceremony. Yet this Romulus Augustus ruled nothing. He was a child placed on the throne by his father Orestes, himself a court official, desperate to wield real power. The boy was emperor in costume only, and even that costume was threadbare. The empire he nominally presided over was no longer an empire at all. By the mid-5th century, the western provinces had been carved away like meat stripped from a carcass. Spain was fractured. North Africa was held by the Vandals. Gaul was a patchwork of kingdoms, and Italy itself was crawling with federated troops who were Roman in name but barbarian in loyalty. The tax base had collapsed. The army was mercenary. and the Senate in Rome was a ceremonial echo of its former self, full of men whose families clung to titles but held no power. The emperors were children, puppets, or prisoners of their generals, crowned and discarded with numbing regularity. What had once been a city that dictated the fate of nations had become a court bickering over scraps. The man who finally ended the charade was Augustus, a Germanic commander of Roman forces in Italy. Like so many before him, he had risen through service in the legions, a reminder that the line between Roman and barbarian had blurred beyond recognition. His soldiers demanded land in Italy as payment for their loyalty. Orestes refused, clinging to the illusion that the old system still applied. Odoacer responded by marching on Ravenna, the imperial capital of the West, and deposing Romulus without a fight. The boy was spared execution, not out of mercy, but because he simply wasn't worth the trouble. He was pensioned off to a villa, quietly removed from history. The last emperor of the West was not martyred. He was retired. Odoacer sent the imperial insignia, the purple cloak, the diadem, the standards, to Constantinople, acknowledging the Eastern Emperor as the sole ruler of the Roman world. In practice, he ruled Italy as king, the first barbarian monarch to govern the ancient heartland of Rome. The message was unmistakable. There was no longer any need to pretend that the West had an emperor. The fiction was over. Rome had passed into the hands of men it had once called barbarians, though by 476 they were less conquerors than caretakers of a ruin already collapsing. The symbolism of this quiet handover was staggering. Rome had once been the terror of the Mediterranean, burning Carthage to the ground, enslaving Greece, and crushing Hannibal with sheer stubbornness. Now it had withered into a bureaucracy that folded at the first push. Its monument still loomed, its senate still met, its rituals still lingered, but all of it was hollow. The eternal city, so confident in its destiny, had died not with a final battle, but with an emperor sent home on early retirement. Eternity had proved mortal after all. For those who lived through it, the collapse was less dramatic than later histories would suggest. Ordinary farmers still planted fields, merchants still traded, and bishops still preached. Life continued, but under new masters. The Roman identity dissolved into local loyalties. Gothic kings in Italy, Frankish rulers in Gaul, Vandal pirates in Africa. To the peasants who had long been crushed by taxes and conscription, the change of regime may have mattered less than whether the harvest survived. The fall of Rome was not the end of life, but the end of illusion, the recognition that the empire no longer held sway over the West. And yet the myth endured. Even as the West rotted, Constantinople continued, wealthier and stronger, claiming to be the true heir of Rome. For another 1,000 years, the Eastern Empire would call itself Roman, its emperors draped in purple, its citizens proclaiming continuity. But in the West, where it had all begun, Rome was gone. The Senate lingered as a talking shop, the monuments crumbled and the population dwindled. The Gothic kings who now ruled Italy preserved the forms of Roman government where convenient, but the substance had vanished. Latin, law and Christianity survived, but the empire itself was finished. Looking back, the irony is overwhelming. Rome had imagined itself eternal, invincible, chosen by destiny. It had wrapped its history in myths of wolves, gods and heroes. It had claimed to civilize the world through conquest, to bring order through domination. Yet when the end came, it was neither glorious nor catastrophic. It was tired, bureaucratic and pathetic. No foreign army stormed the gates in triumph. No decisive battle marked the final curtain. Instead, a boy emperor was quietly dismissed, and the empire that had once ruled the known world slipped into memory. The fall of Rome was not a dramatic explosion, but a drawn-out erosion. Centuries of corruption, inequality, and mismanagement, culminating in a moment so anticlimactic, it feels almost insulting. But perhaps that is the real lesson. Empires do not die in fire and grandeur. They die in paperwork and neglect, in the slow collapse of systems that once seemed eternal. Rome, the city that had conquered Carthage, humbled Greece, and declared itself master of destiny, discovered that eternity has an expiration date. By 476 CE, the Western Empire was gone. The East remained, a shadow of continuity, but the illusion of eternal Rome was shattered. The eternal city was mortal after all, and its corpse would be picked over by kings who had once been its enemies. Rome had promised permanence, but what it delivered was 1,000 years of exhaustion that ended in a whimper. The West was dead, the East endured, and the myth of Rome as eternal was exposed for what it had always been, a story told by men desperate to believe that their mess would last forever. And so, after more than 1,000 years of ambition, blood, marble, and noise, Rome came to its quiet end. Not with the grandeur of a last stand, not with fire raining from the heavens, but with a boy emperor politely dismissed and a barbarian general settling into his new office. The empire that had once boasted of eternity turned out to be as mortal as the rest, undone not by destiny, but by exhaustion. Its collapse was not apocalyptic, but bureaucratic, a steady suffocation under the weight of its own contradictions. The eternal city had promised permanence, but permanence is a myth, and Rome was just another human mess pretending otherwise. The ruins that remain tell only part of the story. Tourists today walk through the Colosseum, marvelling at the arches and the scale, but rarely imagining the screams of the condemned as they were torn apart for amusement. They stroll past the Forum, picturing orators declaiming noble speeches, but not the mobs that jeered, the bribes exchanged, or the bodies displayed on spikes. Marble outlasts memory, and stone sanitizes blood. Rome's legacy is admired as civilization, while the cruelty that sustained it fades conveniently into silence. The aqueducts still stand, the roads still trace their lines across Europe, but the corpses that built them are long forgotten. Rome thought of itself as a bringer of order, a civilizer of barbarians, a city chosen by the gods. In truth, it was a machine of conquest and exploitation, no different in essence from the empires that came before and after. Its republic was riddled with corruption, its empire with despotism. Its vaunted peace was purchased with endless war on the frontiers, its prosperity funded by slavery and plunder. For every marble temple raised, there were 10 villages burned. For every senatorial speech on virtue, there were bribes, betrayals, and assassinations. Eternity, for Rome, was not about justice or truth, but about inertia, the refusal to admit that collapse was already happening. And yet, the illusion was powerful. For centuries, people believed the lie of eternity because Rome itself seemed incapable of dying. It survived Gauls burning its streets, Hannibal stalking its fields, emperors murdering their kin, plagues, invasions, and financial ruin. Each disaster was reframed as destiny, each failure retold as triumph. Rome's true genius was not engineering or law but self-deception. It could fall 100 times and convince itself it had risen stronger. Even its final collapse was retold as transformation, the story that the empire lived on in Constantinople. That eternity had not died but migrated east. The reality was simpler. One half of the empire endured, the other half rotted, and the dream of permanence dissolved with it. The irony is that Rome succeeded in convincing later generations more than it convinced itself. Renaissance scholars, Enlightenment thinkers, and modern tourists all look back on Rome as though it was something grand, something unique, a pinnacle of civilization. They see marble, not mud, law, not corruption, empire, not exhaustion. Rome's propaganda outlived Rome itself. The myths of wolves and founders, of noble senators and wise emperors, survived centuries of retelling. The blood, the screams, the failures were edited out. History remembers Rome as eternal even when eternity lasted only until a Germanic warlord walked into Ravenna and told a boy to go home. Perhaps this is what eternity really means. Not permanence, but memory. Rome is eternal not because it still exists, but because we still talk about it, because its ruins still stand, because its myths are still retold. The empire may have collapsed, but the idea of Rome lingers like smoke. Even so, what lingers is selective, polished and convenient. People remember Augustus's marble and Marcus Aurelius's philosophy, not the famines, the mutilations, or the endless rows of slaves crucified along Roman roads. Eternity, it seems, is always edited for taste. The truth is bleaker. Rome lasted 1,000 years, but it felt like 10,000. An endless cycle of ambition, reform, corruption, collapse, and reform again. Each generation thought it was unique, yet it repeated the same mistakes as the one before. Senators stabbed each other in the name of liberty. Generals marched on Rome in the name of order. Emperors declared themselves saviours while bleeding the provinces dry. The pattern was monotony, disguised as history. Rome's eternity was not glorious but exhausting, a slow-motion tragedy that dragged on for centuries before finally stumbling into silence. When we call Rome eternal, we forget how fragile it always was. From the start, it was a city of contradictions, founded on fratricide, proud of liberty, but built on slavery, obsessed with virtue while addicted to spectacle. Its greatness was always accompanied by its grotesqueness. To admire the ruins without acknowledging the corpses is to repeat Rome's own delusion. The empire that thought itself immortal was petty, cruel, and human. It did not transcend humanity. It embodied its worst habits at scale. In the end, Rome's eternity was simply duration. It lasted longer than most, and for that, it was mistaken for immortal. But permanence is not the same as greatness, and longevity is not the same as virtue. Rome endured because it was ruthless, because it absorbed others' labour, because it was too stubborn to die quickly. That is not eternity. That is inertia. Rome's final lesson is that no matter how much marble you drape over it, human history remains a mess, petty, cruel, fragile, and forgettable. And so, as the echoes of Rome fade, what remains is not glory, but irony. The eternal city was mortal. The eternal empire collapsed, and the blood that sustained them is remembered only as dust beneath tourists' feet. The senators who once bickered in the forum are silent. The gladiators who fought to amuse the mob are dust. The emperors who claimed divinity are forgotten names on broken inscriptions. Rome thought it was building eternity. What it built was a ruin, admired from a distance, stripped of its cruelty, sanitized by time. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story, covering the entire history of Rome. Feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment with another forgotten corner of history you'd like explored next. If you'd like early access to more of these quiet descents into forgotten history, ad-free audio of the episodes, or just want to support the show, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. If you're listening on a podcast app, a rating or review helps more people find their way to these stories. And special thanks to the supporters who make this show possible, including our chroniclers, Andrew S. and Rich Davis. Sleep well.